I'm a 15-year-old girl who often feels left out in my own family, especially when I compare myself to my younger brother, Oliver, who is 14 and adopted. Oliver joined our family about 9 years ago, and it seems like he fits in better than I do. My parents sometimes joke that he looks more like them, saying he's their ideal child, but those jokes hurt me and feel serious. Our family looks like we could be in a lifestyle magazine, representing traditional beauty, a standard I don't think I meet. I was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes as a child, and managing my weight has always been difficult. My parents controlled my eating, which made me feel like I had to sneak food sometimes, because their monitoring felt like deprivation. About 5 months ago, my health took another hit when I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia. This condition sometimes keeps me in a wheelchair because of the severe pain. Adjusting to this has been hard, both physically and mentally. I'm already an introvert, so I spend most of my time in my room, trying not to bother anyone. I feel very lonely but don't want to be a burden. Despite my challenges, I've tried to keep some normalcy, like joining our annual family Christmas photo, which is a long-standing tradition. This year, however, when I got dressed and was ready to take part, my parents awkwardly suggested that the photo should only include them and Oliver. They said my wheelchair would spoil the picture. I offered to stand for a few shots, but they refused, making it clear they didn't want me included at all. Heartbroken, I went back to my room and cried, with no one checking on me. Feeling devastated, I called my grandmother and shared everything with her. She's a strong person who rebuilt her life after losing her husband. She listened to me with understanding and immediately decided to change her will. This surprised my parents and revealed deep issues in our family. What happened showed me that my family's acceptance of me is superficial and conditional. It also highlighted my grandmother's strong support for me during my toughest times, even if it caused drama. Even though their harsh words made me uncomfortable, I had come to terms with the fact that my parents' acceptance of me was conditional and probably wouldn't change. My grandmother has always been a source of strength and inspiration for me. Her unconditional love is a sharp contrast to the conditional acceptance I feel from my parents. I had hoped for a long time that they would treat me better, but that incident during Christmas reminded me that it might never happen. Every time my grandmother suggested that I could live with her, I hesitated, still holding on to the hope that my family would accept me. But that day, I finally agreed to her offer, realizing that in my own home, I was merely tolerated, not truly wanted. The pain of being excluded by my family was deep, but my grandmother was always there to support and comfort me. During our phone call, as I cried and shared my heartache, she promised to take me away as soon as she returned from her cruise. She leads an adventurous life filled with friends and laughter, which is very different from the solitude of my own room. The days leading up to her arrival were filled with silence at home. I went through my usual routine of school and isolation, while my parents and Oliver acted like everything was fine, hiding the tension beneath the surface. When my grandmother arrived, I was the one to welcome her into our home. My parents were unaware of the change that was about to happen. They greeted her casually, not realizing she knew about their exclusion of me from the family photo. When she confronted them, they were initially confused about how she knew, but soon figured out that I must have told her. Instead of apologizing, they brushed off the incident, repeating their excuses about not wanting to bother me with standing or having my wheelchair in the photo. I couldn't hold back anymore. I told them and my grandmother that their excuses were just a cover for their discomfort with including me. I pointed out how differently they treated Oliver compared to me, emphasizing that even though he was adopted, he was embraced as their own, while I, their biological daughter, was treated like an outsider. Oliver looked away, perhaps feeling guilty or recognizing the truth in what I said. My parents reacted defensively, accusing me of being dramatic and spoiled. They expected an apology from me for simply expressing the inequality and neglect I felt. They couldn't see how their actions and words were not just personal slights, but deep wounds to my sense of belonging. As painful as it was to confront these truths, my grandmother's presence gave me the strength to stand up for myself. Her unwavering support made me realize that I deserved to be in an environment where I was valued and loved unconditionally. With her, I knew I would find the acceptance and love that was so missing in my own home. I was ready to leave, not just the house, but also the conditional love that had defined my life there. My grandmother promised to take me with her, and I trusted her completely, eager for a new beginning where I could truly feel part of a family. Now that we have started to reconnect, things are gradually improving between us. The conversation with my grandmother opened my eyes to many things, including, I realized how my brother had been influenced by our parents' behavior toward me. I think he picked up on their cues without really understanding how his actions affected me. However, his willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and reach out to repair our relationship meant a lot to me in that moment. When I was ready to defend myself further, my grandmother stepped in, making it clear she was there to end the mistreatment I had endured for so long. My parents looked confused when she announced that she would be taking me to live with her. They had always made me feel like a burden, and now they didn't even try to stop me from leaving. This was a painful confirmation of what I had always felt, that they didn't truly want me as part of the family. The silence that followed my grandmother's announcement was deafening. At first, my parents seemed indifferent, but their true feelings came out when she said she was cutting them out of her will. Suddenly, they scrambled to defend their position, revealing just how materialistic they were. My grandmother had built a successful grocery store business and had accumulated considerable wealth, but I had never cared about that. I loved her for who she was, not for what she had. Unlike my parents, my love for her was unconditional. She showed my parents the revised will, making it clear that everything would now go to Oliver and me. The drama escalated as they pleaded and bargained with her, but my grandmother was unmoved by their tears. She instructed me to pack my things and get ready to leave with her immediately. I was prepared for this moment, knowing that living with her would be a healthier environment for me. As I gathered my belongings, my parents continued their desperate pleas, but Oliver was the only one who seemed to genuinely care about saying goodbye. Driving away from that house felt liberating but bittersweet. I was leaving behind painful memories, but I was also moving toward a new chapter of my life, one filled with real love and support from my grandmother. Living with her has brought so much peace to my life. Being closer to school allows me to get more sleep and feel less stressed in the mornings. Every day feels like a step toward healing. Shortly after I left, Oliver sent me a message. He apologized for his past behavior and thanked me for always treating him like a true brother. He recognized how much better his life was because of our parents' decision to adopt him and was eager to repair our bond. We started spending time together at school to strengthen our relationship. These changes weren't easy, but they were necessary. The truth had been painful, but it also set me free. With my grandmother's support and a renewed relationship with Oliver, I finally started to feel like I belonged to a family that truly cared about me. Meanwhile, Oliver had always been treated as a full member of the family, especially by our parents. Recently, during one of our casual hangouts, Oliver mentioned something that had been weighing heavily on me. We were chatting, and I couldn't help but ask about what was happening back at the house. He shared that tensions were high between our parents since I moved out, and they had been caught up in a blame game. My mom accused my dad of being the reason I felt pushed away for so long, especially pointing to his suggestion to exclude me from the family Christmas photo. On the other hand, my dad argued that my mom always overreacted to challenges, making it seem like having me as a child was the hardest thing she had ever faced. Oliver casually mentioned that he was worried they might end up getting divorced because of how things were between them. Although he made this comment in passing, it stuck with me and left me feeling uneasy. I know it's irrational, but part of me can't shake the feeling that if they do get divorced, it would somehow be my fault. Maybe I overreacted by being hurt about the photo incident, and perhaps they never meant to make me feel like a burden. These thoughts are hard to shake, and I find myself stuck in a loop of self-blame and regret. Even though I know deep down that their marital problems are not my responsibility, it's difficult not to feel like a doormat for thinking this way. That's why I'm turning to this community for some objective reassurance. To provide some context for those who are curious, my grandmother recently changed her will to leave everything to Oliver and me, mainly because of how our parents mishandled things with me. Oliver hadn't been part of the negative behavior, and at his young age, my grandmother and I both feel he deserves a chance to make up for any past mistakes. It wouldn't be fair to push him away because of our parents' actions. If we did, we'd be no different from them. People have also asked about Oliver's background. His biological mother was only 17 when she had him and had to leave college because of her pregnancy and struggles with substance abuse. His father was mostly absent, only appearing sporadically in his life. Oliver's maternal grandparents tried to help their daughter become a better mother, but eventually encouraged her to consider adoption when Oliver was 7, believing it would give him a better future. My parents were already thinking about adoption due to complications from my mother's first pregnancy and didn't want to risk going through that again. They knew Oliver's biological mother's cousin from college, which is how they found out about his situation. They fostered him for a while before officially adopting him. Oliver has stayed in touch with his grandparents, meeting them monthly, but he hasn't had contact with his parents since the adoption. His mother finds it too painful to see him, and his father has completely disappeared from his life. Navigating these complex family relationships has been challenging, but talking about these issues here helps me process my feelings and hopefully gain some clarity and support from others who might have similar experiences. Recently, my parents' sudden apology felt insincere and seemed more about wanting to fix their image before I left for college. It felt like an attempt to smooth things over without addressing the real issues that caused the rift in the first place. In the past, I made some comments in frustration about Oliver being adopted during a heated argument, which I regret. I've apologized to him because he means the world to me, and I never wanted him to feel like he was any less a part of our family. I've always seen Oliver as my brother, not just because we were raised together, but because I genuinely care for him. Despite the rocky phases we've experienced, I'm committed to maintaining a strong relationship with him. We've been through a lot because of our parents' behavior, and I refuse to let that drive a wedge between us. I even offered Oliver the option to come and live with me and our grandmother if things at home become unbearable. The idea isn't to pull him away from our parents, but to provide him with a safe and peaceful alternative if he needs it. In my recent updates, I've been overwhelmed by the support from this community. It's been reassuring to hear from others who've been in similar situations, and it has helped me feel less isolated after discussing everything with my grandmother. My grandmother reminded me that I wasn't responsible for my parents' marital issues. She explained that my parents were directing their frustrations at each other because they no longer had me to focus on. Their problems weren't caused by me standing up for myself, but by their inability to handle their issues constructively. If they do end up divorcing, it would be sad, but it's not my burden to carry. Oliver and I have talked about this too. He reassured me that he didn't mean to make me feel guilty about their problems. He was just answering my question. Recently, my parents visited unexpectedly to discuss our strained relationship. They took time off work to talk, but it wasn't a great day for me, and I wasn't in the right headspace to engage with them. They expressed a desire to spend time with me before I head off to college and attempted an apology, but it felt like they were saying they were sorry I felt offended rather than recognizing that their actions were hurtful. This wording didn't sit well with me. It felt like they were avoiding the real issue. I suggested they write their thoughts in an email or come back another time when I was more prepared to talk. I needed space to process, and rushing a conversation wasn't going to solve anything. Some might think I was avoiding the issue, but I needed to manage the situation on my own terms, especially given the emotional toll their behavior had on me. Oliver understands my stance and supports my decision. We've promised each other not to let family disputes affect our bond, regardless of what happens with our parents. We are committed to supporting each other and ensuring that the challenges we face don't erode the trust and love we've rebuilt. After several challenging interactions, it's clear that my parents aren't genuinely trying to understand me or correct their past mistakes. During a recent conversation, I tried to explain that my feelings were hurt because of their actions, but instead of acknowledging this and trying to make amends, they shifted the blame to my distance for their ignorance of my struggles. This only confirmed my suspicion that they were not capable of genuine apologies and were more interested in making me feel responsible. Feeling increasingly frustrated and realizing this blame game was going nowhere, I asked them to leave. They resisted, insisting we needed to have a full discussion, as if a simple conversation could fix the deep-rooted issues between us. They seemed to think that because they provided for me, which were just basic parental responsibilities, they deserved this conversation. I couldn't engage any further without getting upset, so I decided to retreat to my room. At that point, my dad escalated the situation by demanding that I stay and talk. Thankfully, my grandmother was there to intervene. She firmly told my dad that raising his voice wasn't acceptable in her home, especially after the way they had treated me. She made it clear that if I chose not to engage, they had to respect my decision and leave. This incident was an eye-opener for both me and my parents. It showed me that their main concern was how our family problems might look to others, rather than the actual well-being of their children. They worried about appearances and feared what people might think if they knew I had moved in with my grandmother. I was beyond caring about their reputation. I was focused on my own future and healing. After they left, my grandmother and I discussed whether I wanted to see my parents again soon. For now, my answer was a definite no. She supported my decision, assuring me that she wouldn't allow them to drop by uninvited next time. I also talked to Oliver about their visit. He was surprised by their actions and mentioned that the mood at home was gloomy since their return. While I felt for him, I knew I needed to maintain my distance for my own mental health. I'll be leaving for college in a week. I got into my first choice school, and my grandmother has arranged everything for my move. She'll even stay with me for the first couple of weeks to help me settle into my new apartment. This is a big step, living on my own, but I'm ready and looking forward to the future. My mental health has improved a lot without the constant stress from my parents. Oliver and I plan to stay in close contact through FaceTime, aiming to chat at least once a week. Although I'm sad to leave my current life and the security of my grandmother's home, I'm genuinely excited about starting this new chapter.
They say, happy is the man who goes to work with pleasure in the morning and returns home with joy in the evening. According to this formula, Hugh was unhappy in all respects. In the morning, he usually had to overpower himself not to cry out, going to his hated job at the shopping centre, and in the evening he sadly trudged home, knowing that he would once again be nagged by his wife, and even worse, his mother-in-law. Perhaps if his mother-in-law had less influence over his wife, things would be different, but the elderly woman practically lived with them. She had her own place, and it was a nice one. Hugh would do repairs there himself, as he was highly skilled in this field. However, the elderly woman got bored being alone, so she came to visit the couple every day, and sometimes even stayed overnight. Under her influence, Gina, Hugh's wife, changed for the worse. She constantly nagged her husband, accusing him of all kinds of faults and failures. It wasn't always like this. Hugh used to earn decent money doing repairs and was the head of his team. They had plenty of orders and could choose the most lucrative ones. But one day he suffered a setback. He was hit by a car and lost his health and ability to work. His leg was broken and he had an excruciating back pain. He spent a long time recovering and was unable to work. Initially, his wife took care of him, but as soon as she realized that the money was running out, she distanced herself from him. She was accustomed to the good life, and the prospect of poverty frightened her. She didn't work herself and had no intention of doing so. When Hugh married Gina, his mother-in-law, Mrs. Weller, warned him that her daughter would never work. Let other women work like horses if they couldn't find a decent husband. A smart woman will never work, and my daughter is smart. And if you suddenly can't provide for her, well, there's no point in talking to you, she said. The young man was so in love with Gina, his green-eyed blonde wife, that he was willing to give her the world. He worked tirelessly, fulfilling her every wish. He fulfilled her every whim, only he could not decide on a mortgage, as his wife and mother-in-law tried to persuade him. "I'll save up for an apartment myself," Hugh kept saying. The apartment they lived in belonged to Hugh's relative, who had married and moved abroad. She didn't need the money, but she was in no hurry to part with the apartment either. She didn't want to rent it out to strangers, so she invited Hugh and his wife to live there, only paying for utilities. However, the apartment was small for Gina's standards, and she wanted to move out as soon as possible. Lately, her constant topic of conversation was, "Hugh, when are we going to move out? Hugh, why don't you take out a mortgage?" She became particularly insistent about the mortgage after she had squandered all of her husband's savings. Even her mother called Gina stupid when she found out how much money she had wasted on what she considered to be nonsense. Despite knowing that her husband was ill and couldn't work for a while, Gina continued to go out to restaurants and shopping with her friends, spending money on expensive hair treatments and the like. With no other option, Hugh, who hadn't fully recovered from the accident, had to find a job. He couldn't do any repairs anymore, at least not for now. Lifting heavy objects was contraindicated, and he experienced pain in his back and leg. Eventually, he got a job as a security guard at a clothing store. Of course, standing on his feet for a 12-hour shift was incredibly difficult, especially in his condition. And of course, he wanted to do more creative work, not spend his time looking out for shoplifters. But now he had no choice. To earn extra money, Hugh also took on a night watchman job at a warehouse. At least there he could sit or walk around instead of standing. However, it was even more boring than the store. There was no one to interact with, no movement. He often felt sleepy. To entertain himself, he watched videos on his smartphone about bushcraft, survival in the wild, and abandoned villages in the deep forest. Sometimes he felt the urge to leave everything behind and go somewhere far away, away from people, just him and nature. He wanted to live in solitude and start afresh. When he was healthy, there were always people around, colleagues, friends and acquaintances. But after the injury, they all disappeared. Only the most loyal ones remained. However, Hugh didn't want unnecessary socializing. He had reevaluated and realized many things. That's why he wanted to disappear for a while, to retreat. But it was impossible. Where could he go? He knew a little about such places, having already researched the subject. But what about his wife? She wouldn't go with him, and she wouldn't let him go alone. And it would be incredibly difficult to part with Gina. He loved her too much. She nagged him at home, but it was easy to understand her. He had promised her a better life, and look what happened in the end. On the other hand, Hugh wasn't responsible for the accident. It was the drunken rich man who ran the red light. Lost in his heavy thoughts, Hugh didn't notice how he reached home. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the time he was supposed to be at work. However, today there was an emergency at their shopping centre. Someone had called in a false threat, resulting in the police cordoning off the area and sending employees home. Well, at least I'll get 5 hours of sleep before the night, Hugh reasoned. As he approached his door, he heard voices inside. His wife and mother-in-law. Hugh noticed that the door was slightly ajar. Was Mrs. Weller in such a hurry to see her daughter that she forgot to close the door? The thought of her mistake pleased him, because now he would come in and chastise her for her absent-mindedness. It wasn't always him who should be the target of her ridicule. Let her be the accused for once. Hugh quietly opened the door and entered the apartment. He intended to sneak into the living room and surprise his mother-in-law, then lecture her about locking the doors. However, when he heard the emotional conversation between the women, he froze in place. Well, you know, daughter, it's not so bad that Ken got you pregnant. With Hugh, I wouldn't have grandchildren until I'm very old. He's a weakling, and Ken is a real man, the kind of guy you should have a child with. It doesn't matter who you're pregnant with. It'll still be my grandson. Mum, but Ken is married, Gina sobbed. Yes, you've made a mistake in this. I've told you 1,000,000 times not to get involved with married people. Well, you had a fling. It happens. But there's no reason to fall in love. What am I supposed to do now? What should you do? Her mother grinned. Give birth, of course. I'm sorry I yelled at you earlier. Now I think it's for the best. And you know what else? What? I think Hugh will finally agree to take out a mortgage now. His salary is official. All his documents are in order. The bank will approve it. You can't live in this one-room apartment with a baby. Who knows how things will turn out? If Ken divorces his wife, you can go to him, and the baby will grow up with his daddy. And Hugh will also pay child support. So don't worry, everything will be fine, daughter. Listening to his wife and mother-in-law's conversation, Hugh was in frustration. Is Gina pregnant with another man's child? Did she cheat on him? Why does fate punish me again? I always tried to be a decent family man, love my wife, respect my mother-in-law, but they thanked me with such an ugly surprise. And now what? Burst into the room and shout, "Aha, gotcha!" It would be dramatic but foolish. Divorce? Yes, definitely. I love children, but I'm not going to take responsibility for my wife's and another man's sins. Thoughts swirled in the deceived husband's mind like scattered puzzles. Unsure of what to do, Hugh left the apartment, slamming the door loudly. The surprise caused his wife and mother-in-law to startle simultaneously. "Did you hear that?" "What was that?" asked Gina. "I think it was the door." "Mum, did you forget to lock the door?" "Well, it happens. I was in a hurry." While the women argued about who had forgotten to close the door and why, Hugh managed to walk 2 blocks and outlined a plan of action in his head. There was nothing else keeping him in this city. He could safely leave and fulfill his dream of becoming a Robinson. just as he had once dreamed. To think about life, to zero his mind. Fortunately, there was still some money left in his account. He was also going to sell some electronics, a computer, things he wasn't going to need anytime soon. Of course, it would be cheap because he needed to sell them now, but he didn't care. The important thing was to escape the city, where lies and hypocrisy reigned. He didn't want to think, to imagine how his wife had reached the point of infidelity, how long it had been going on. There were probably some signs that Hugh had missed, had not noticed due to inattention, or simply did not want to notice. One thing he knew for sure was that the name Ken had been mentioned too often in his family lately. Ken was Gina's classmate. Since attending a reunion, his name had been repeatedly mentioned. At first, Hugh even rejoiced that his wife had such a wonderful friend. At that time, he himself was unable to take care of his wife, as he believed she deserved. He couldn't help her with anything, take her out or do something for her. So it was great that there was a man who was willing to take care of her. Hugh didn't even dare to doubt his wife's fidelity, especially since Ken was also married, with a family and children. But it turned out that this was not a barrier to infidelity. After withdrawing all money, the man went shopping at the tourist store and bought a complete outfit for surviving in the wilderness. Of course, he didn't plan to actually survive in the forest. He wanted to find an empty house somewhere in a backwoods village and live there without news, internet, or contact with the outside world. He bought many things from the store, a large backpack, similar to that of a mountaineer, a sleeping bag, ropes, a gas burner, a knife, and boots. He even had to call a cab because he couldn't carry everything himself. Gina was speechless when Hugh brought all his stuff home and started lovingly looking at fishing rods, lanterns, sturdy hiking boots, and other accessories. "What the hell is this?" roared the mother-in-law. "And you, Mrs. Weller, relax. Don't get worked up. You're expecting a grandson." "And how do you know?" gasped Gina. "A magpie brought the news," sarcastically replied her husband. "Hugh," sang affectionately to her mother-in-law. "Well, why are you spoiling the surprise? Gina wanted to inform you in an unusual way, to surprise and delight you. Are you happy that you and Gina will have a baby boy?" "Yes, I am pleased that Gina and Ken are going to have a baby boy," Hugh teased Mrs. Weller. "I hope that the wife of the future father, as well as his children, will also be happy with that news." Gina turned pale, but her mother, to her credit, did not lose her composure. "Hugh," she said in an iron tone, "shame on you. Your wife is pregnant, you should be happy, but you say such things. You accuse her of cheating on another man, and you're slandering her. I didn't expect this from you, Hugh, and I'm deeply disappointed." "Mrs. Weller, can't you be disappointed with me somewhere else, like at your home?" "You're so rude, Hugh," the mother-in-law said through her teeth. "Mum, stop, please. I'll handle it myself." Gina stopped her quietly. "Hugh, why did you decide that the child is not yours?" "Gina, dear, I'm not going to discuss this, and I'm not holding you, and I don't want you to hold me. I demand a divorce. I know perfectly well that while you are pregnant, we will not be divorced. It can only be done on your own initiative, so please, let's separate amicably," the man calmly replied. "Well, no," Mrs. Weller intervened again. "Tomorrow Gina will get a pregnancy certificate. The child will be born in marriage, and you will be obliged to recognize it." "Well, all right. Only in this case, I go and tell Ken's wife everything. Who's her father, the owner of the big firm where Ken works? I wonder if he'll like the fact that his son-in-law has got an offspring on the side. I don't know, and in general, immediately after the birth of the child, I'll demand a DNA test, and as soon as I get the result, I'll sue you and get compensation for more damages. Is that what you want?" Hugh straightened up and looked menacingly at his wife. Under his gaze, she seemed small and unhappy, and even felt sorry for her. The mother-in-law was gnashing her teeth in anger. If she had the chance, she would have stuck her son-in-law with the huge serrated hunting knife he had just been holding. "What a scoundrel you are, Hugh," hissed the woman. "Ooh, how you've changed your voice. What if I had made a child on the side? How would you react? Forgive and accept? I doubt it. And in general, please leave the apartment. I had put up with you only for the sake of your daughter before." "It's not your apartment, it's hers too," shrieked the mother-in-law. "She has the right to live here and decide whether I stay or go." "Really? Well, then you both stay here and I'll leave. Oh, by the way, there's a bill for the utility. Pay it." "Mum, please let us be alone and talk to each other," Gina begged. "Daughter, I won't leave you alone with this crazy man," protested the woman. "Mum, please. We're adults. We'll sort it out ourselves." Groaning in her heart, Mrs. Weller left the apartment, and the couple remained to have a difficult conversation. Gina tried to fix the shards of their marriage, but Hugh thought that a broken cup would not be glued together, and the bright image of his once sinless wife was destroyed forever. "Gina," Hugh said calmly, "I don't want to cause a scene or have a confrontation, but it happened like this. You fell in love with another man, or just gave in to a fleeting desire. I don't know. You know better. But you need to take responsibility for your actions. You're an adult. Take control of your life. And Ken needs to take responsibility for what he did. Talk to him. Maybe, if he doesn't want to recognize the child, he'll at least provide financial support. Understand that I'm not your slave, and I won't go along with your wishes. Let's have a civilized relationship." "Hugh, will you leave your pregnant woman?" Gina asked quietly. "Ask the same question, but not to me. Ask the father of your child," replied the man calmly. To Gina's credit, she didn't become stubborn or throw a tantrum. She simply accepted that Hugh was leaving her. Of course she cried into her pillow, but the next day she packed her things and went to her mother's. When Gina left, Hugh felt relieved. No one would hinder him from focusing on his own thoughts. But of course, he was hurt deep in his heart. They had spent so many years together, and he had thought he had a family and a loving wife, and instantly his world was shattered. The man experienced a range of emotions, from hatred towards the betrayer to forgiveness and complete indifference. Then resentment and hatred resurfaced. The important thing was not to drink and to hold on. Moving out should help. As soon as the divorce was finalized, Hugh immediately started to materialize his plan. He began to see it as a second chance. Maybe he was not destined to live like everyone else, in an overcrowded concrete box of a city. Although, who knows, maybe he would spend some time in nature, getting bitten by hungry gadflies, and then return to an apartment with heating and hot water. Fortunately, Hugh still had his loyal friends. It was they who suggested a place for him to move to. "Don't be foolish, don't act impulsively," said a friend. "I know a place where old Alfred lives. He is a hermit. Many people consider him a forest spirit. He's already more than 90 years old, but he is strong and not boring to talk to. The place is wild. If something happens to you there, or if you can't survive, he'll take you out, or inform the gamekeeper through a radio. In general, go to Alfred. He'll take you in, and you can become a helper to him and do a good deed." And Hugh went. A strange feeling overcame him as he left his hometown. Ahead of him was an unknown road. What awaited him there, beyond the horizon? It was both joyful and unsettling, and Hugh wasn't the only one who felt this way. A young girl named Marcy was walking along the highway, carrying a large old backpack on her shoulders. She was wearing a worn-out t-shirt, a man's jacket that didn't fit her, old jeans, and completely broken sneakers. The girl tried to hitchhike, but some cars passed by, and she was afraid to get into others. It was dangerous for a girl to travel alone, but Marcy had no other choice. She had escaped from a nightmare that made any highway maniac seem like an angel. Marcy spent her childhood in a prosperous family. However, after her mother's death, Her father turned to alcohol, quit his job, and rapidly spiraled downwards, dragging his children with him. Then the head of the family brought home a stepmother, a downcast, marginalised woman who had no place to live, but nevertheless she was eager to teach everyone and command everyone. The stepmother quickly turned their apartment into bedlam, and Marcy's older sister hurriedly fled the place after getting married, while Marcy stayed behind. She tried to seek help and protection from friends, but always returned home. Despite his alcoholism, Marcy still saw her father as a kind man, remembering the times when he was normal. Growing up in such an unhealthy environment, Marcy struggled to finish school and was unable to pursue further education. She resorted to odd jobs to making a living, but life became increasingly difficult, and finally she packed her belongings and left. A friend kindly gave her a jacket to replace the one torn by her stepmother. Marcy yearned to start a new life away from her city. She believed that the capital offered abundant job opportunities and a place to live. Eventually, she caught a ride with a hitchhiker and arrived in Megapolis. Although she felt apprehensive about the unknown, Marcy was hopeful that she would find a better life in the capital than among alcoholics in a dilapidated apartment infested with bedbugs. The vastness of the city overwhelmed Marcy, who came from a small provincial town. Everything seemed enormous and unfamiliar, making her feel unsteady. The bustling and noisy train station only added to her disorientation. At the station, she bought a piece of pie and coffee, considering it an extravagant expense. Sitting in the waiting room, she pondered her next move. She had nowhere to go and couldn't stay in the waiting room indefinitely, although they wouldn't kick her out, but spending the night at a train station felt odd. Marcy wondered if she could find a hostel and how much it would cost. She regretted not thinking about it beforehand and questioned her impulsive decision to take such a gamble. Suddenly, a tall guy in a leather jacket, whom Marcy had noticed earlier, approached her. He had walked by with friends, then returned alone, repeatedly glancing at her. He offered to buy her a drink since her coffee had run out. Marcy quickly declined, but the stranger left and soon returned with a cup of coffee, smiling and revealing his yellowish teeth. He handed her the cup, saying, "Here you go, or you'll have to eat the pie dry." The girl thanked the guy for the treat, and he introduced himself as Dan. He gave Marcy mixed feelings, something unpleasant, yet trustworthy. "Listen, Marcy, have you ever lived in a motorhome?" "No," the girl shook her head. "Would you like to?" "I don't know. I haven't really thought about it." "Why don't you come with us? I'm staying with some friends outside of town. You won't have enough for a hostel anyway, and we'll help you out. In turn, you'll help us in a feminine way. No, don't get me wrong. You'll be cooking the food and cleaning the cages." "Cages?" Marcy was surprised. "Yeah, didn't I mention it? We transport animals. All sorts of foxes." "Foxes? Do you have a menagerie?" the girl wondered. "Well, you could say that," the guy shrugged. "No, I still don't agree," Marcy replied after considering, and to avoid further bother from the guy, she said her goodbyes and left. "Marcy, we have a bear cub. It's small and affectionate like a puppy," the guy called after her. Perhaps he didn't anticipate such a reaction from her, but the girl stopped and looked at the boy attentively. "Bear cub?" she questioned. Dan hurriedly approached her and whispered, "Yes, but it's illegal to keep a bear, so don't talk about it." "Don't even think about it. We're saving him. They killed his mother and brother and sent them to a restaurant. It's illegal to hunt bears with cubs, but the riches don't follow the rules, and this little guy was left behind. He would have died in the forest anyway." Marcy's mouth dropped open in surprise. Her opinion of Dan dramatically changed. It turned out he was a good person who saved animals. "All right," Marcy replied. "I'm in." "Okay, let's wait for my friends then," said the guy. They left the station building, walked a short distance to the designated spot, and started waiting for the car. Soon Dan's friends arrived. There were two of them sitting in a used SUV. "Hello," Marcy greeted politely. "Well, hello," the scruffy guy replied. The other, a bald man with a big nose, simply nodded. They invited the girl to get into the car. Marcy hesitated. For some reason she didn't like these men, but she didn't know anyone else in town, so she got in the car. As soon as the SUV started moving, Marcy realized there was no turning back. Initially, fear gripped her heart, but soon she realized that the guys, despite not being the most attractive, had no intention of harming her. But it turned out they were taking her far away from town. Marcy felt tense. They took several turns through a wooded area until they reached a clearing. There was a small camp set up with tents, trailers and vans. "This is our temporary camp. You could say we're nomadic people, haulers of sorts. We transport animals. It's fun with us. We're not animals, we don't bite," the scruffy guy attempted to joke. Marcy shivered. She didn't like the place or the people, but it was too late to turn back. Stepping out of the car, Marcy surveyed her surroundings and caught the gazes of those present. Unpleasant men with tobacco-stained teeth and obviously loved to drink. However, she smiled politely at each of them, not wanting to turn them against her. The young girl felt uncomfortable in the company of men, but Dan assured her that she would be safe here. And indeed, the girl was well taken care of. They provided her with a comfortable sleeping place in a separate tent, and of course they showed her their charges. Mostly foxes, unhappy and frightened, locked in cramped cages. "We are taking them to the places where the dogs are taught to hunt animals," Dan said, as if it was nothing special. "How horrible! Don't you feel sorry for the poor animals?" "Why pity them? In the wild, even worse conditions await them. They face challenges such as finding food, enduring the cold, fighting diseases, and competing for territory." "Yes, but it's freedom. Here it's certain death, without a chance to survive. And personally, I would ban hunting." Marcy frowned. "You're thinking with your female brain," Dan grinned. "Firstly, controlling the animal population is important, and hunters fulfill that mission. Secondly, hunting is ingrained in men. If we stop hunting, we'll become weak. Do you understand?" "No." The girl shook her head. "I don't understand that." "But you eat meat, drink milk and enjoy eggs, don't you? Have you ever considered the cruelty involved in meat and dairy production? Trust me, we're much less cruel than some farms. Come on, let me show you a bear cub." The girl sighed and followed Dan. Opening the van door, he revealed a small cage with a frightened bear cub inside. "Oh, it's so cute," whispered Marcy. "Can I hold him?" "You can, but be careful, he might bite. And, by the way, I have a stun gun." "Are you going to shock him?" Marcy couldn't believe what she was hearing. It was so cruel. "Look, why is he locked up? It's daytime. Maybe he could go for a walk. Put him on a leash and let him roam around. Or at least put his cage outside in the sunshine. Let him breathe fresh air." "No, I can't. He gets nervous. And then I can't calm him down. But when it's dark, he's calm. I'll give you a bottle. You can feed him milk." Dan walked away and soon returned with a dirty feeding bottle. "But milk is cold," said the girl, holding the bottle in her hands. "It's fine. It won't catch cold. It can drink it safely." Dan laughed. But the girl didn't obey. She heated the water and held the bottle in the pot to warm up its contents a little. Then she opened the cage and carefully picked up the bear. The frightened baby, with a large dark spot around its eye, resisted weakly. It seemed powerless. It didn't even immediately respond to the milk the girl offered. "I think he has diarrhea," Marcy observed. "Really? Bear disease? That's not good. By the way, we have a wealthy client who ordered him. He's paying a good amount of money. Therefore, as a token of appreciation for your shelter, clean his cage and wash him," said Dan, and went off to attend to other men, leaving Marcy to take care of the little bear. After feeding him, she found a wash basin and used it to wash the poor creature. The bear cub grumbled and complained in his own bear language, but didn't attempt to bite. "You're a good one," Marcy soothed him. "My little one, where's your mummy? Why are you alone?" His mummy and little brother have become gourmet meals. The wealthy people enjoy bear meat. Even foreigners come and try it, and they're delighted. One of the campers chuckled. Marcy didn't say anything, but pressed her lips together and walked away from the unpleasant man. What a terrible camp and some wicked men. Marcy realized she didn't want to stay there. No, they're not just hunters. They're torturers. Dan, is all of this legal? She asked the lanky acquaintance from the train station as she finished cleaning the cage. Well, in fact, it's better to stay out of sight of the police and the zoo volunteers. On the other hand, who's going to punish us? Dan hummed. Even the higher-ups find amusement in hunting, baiting, and consuming wild meat. We are an important part of this, so even if they catch us, they'll lose our case somewhere in the system. I see, the girl sighed. Tonight, Marcy persuaded Dan to allow the little bear outside. Although it was tethered, it was still a better option than being confined to a cage. As the people gathered around the campfire, the intoxicated with drinks men started trying to impress the girl with their jokes and banter. However, their humour mostly revolved around crude and offensive toilet humour. During an emotionally charged conversation, one of the campers asked if Marcy wanted to see how bears in circuses were taught to dance. Curious, Marcy replied, "Show me, but only if it's humane." The camper eagerly obliged. Before Marcy could fully comprehend what was happening, the camper scooped up a shovel full of hot coals and threw them on the ground. He then placed the bear cub on the burning coals, restraining him with a leash to prevent escape. The poor baby bear let out pitiful roars, cried loudly, and desperately tried to escape the painful ordeal. Meanwhile, the tormentor turned on some music. "Look, he's dancing!" the camper exclaimed with satisfaction. After a few more sessions like this, he'll dance without the coals whenever the music plays. Horrified, Marcy screamed, "Stop! Please!" She attempted to rush to the bear's rescue, but was restrained by Dan's arm. "Have you never been to a circus? That's precisely how bears are trained there," Dan replied callously. Marcy screamed and struggled, desperate to end the torture. Her heart ached at the sight of the innocent bear cub dancing on the burning coals. "Stop!" she suddenly exclaimed. "You're ruining your investment. He's already sick. You won't get paid for this." "Enough," Dan agreed, and nonchalantly placed the bear back into its cage. "That's it, Marcy. Go to bed too. I don't need any hysterics here." While the men stayed by the fire, Marcy retired to her tent. She locked it securely to ensure no one would disturb her. However, sleep eluded her. She couldn't stop thinking about the sick bear cub and the caged foxes. Suddenly, she felt someone attempting to break into her tent. "Who is it?" the frightened girl asked. "It's me, Dan, open up. I'm coming in anyway," he slurred in a drunken voice. Reluctantly, Marcy unlocked the tent. Memories of similar intrusions during her childhood with her father flooded her mind. His friends would knock on her door. Back then she would lock the door and that's it. But now she had to open the tent to avoid angering Dan. "What do you want?" Marcy asked, pretending not to understand why he had come. "Let's chat," the drunk suggested. Dan sat down beside her and placed his hand on her knee. "I'm tired," Marcy mumbled. "Just stay sitting or lying down a bit," he said, trying to roll Marcy onto her side. "What are you doing?" the girl protested. "Marcy, I want a little love," he said with an unpleasant smile. "Oh," Marcy realized. "So why didn't you just tell me you were interested in me from the beginning? I would have least have freshened up. As it is, I'm not shaved, unwashed, and wearing not clean underwear." "Yuck!" Dan grimaced, clearly disgusted. "That's accurately what I'm saying. Yuck. Let's do this another time. I'll clean up and tomorrow you can come back. I'll give you a real treat. But for now, just go, okay? You're no good to me when you're drunk. And tell your friends to leave me alone." "All right. If you deceive me, you'll regret it. Got it?" "Yes, I understand. I won't deceive you," Marcy said casually, even though fear began to make her jaw tremble. Admittedly, the girl didn't expect her tactics to work. It wasn't easy to get rid of drunken men, yet somehow she succeeded. I must leave here tomorrow, she vowed, and I'll save the bear. After waiting until everyone was asleep, she went to the vans, intending to open the cages and let the foxes out. But everything was locked so securely that the saviour's attempts led to nothing. She had to go back to the tent, wiping away her tears of regret. Later, many years later, Marcy would go to that day and berate herself for not being able to help those foxes. In the morning, the girl approached one of the men and asked, "Listen, where do you want me to bury the bear?" "What do you mean, bury it?" the man exclaimed in surprise. "Well, he's not well. He's about to die," the girl said nonchalantly. "Come on, let's go and see," the man shouted. They opened the van and the cage, only to find the bear cub covered in a foul-smelling, suspicious coloured slurry. The bottom of the cage was also soiled. "What's wrong with him?" the man asked. "It seems like he has bloody diarrhea and vomiting, but it's your own fault. You made him sick by feeding him anything and everything and torturing him," the girl replied. "What's happening here?" Dan, who had approached, asked. "The bear cub's dying," the man replied. "Oh no, what should we do?" "There's nothing you can do," Marcy said dismissively. "He won't be here by evening. You've played a bad game." "But the client is waiting," the man exclaimed, grabbing his head. "I'll take him to Dr. Lynch," Dan declared. "Who's that?" the girl asked. "He's our veterinarian. He won't let him die," Dan replied, heading towards the car. "Wait, I'm coming with you," the girl said. "Okay, but then help me carry the cage," Dan said. No, I'll wrap him in a blanket and carry him in my arms," Marcy suggested. "Don't be silly. He'll make a mess all over the cabin. Put him in the trunk," the man argued. "Dan, do you want tonight to be like what I planned for you yesterday? Do you want that?" "Well then, don't argue," the girl said firmly. Reluctantly, he agreed. When Marcy got to the car, Dan, who was ready to leave, asked, "What do you need the backpack for?" "My stuff is in there," the girl replied, confused. No, leave the backpack," he demanded. "You have no right," Marcy resented. "I do, and I have the right to demand a guarantee. So put the backpack down. No one's taking it. No one wants your female belongings." Sighing, Marcy dropped the backpack on the ground and pushed it away with her foot. At least she had time to scatter her passport, money, and cell phone in her pockets. "Okay, let's go. We have to hurry." Wrapped in a blanket, the little bear grunted and fussed in his diaper as he stuck his muzzle out, his black nose moving restlessly, sniffing the air. "Look, I think he's already being active," said the guy. "Oh, really? He's vomiting blood. He doesn't know what's going on, so he's fussing." Fortunately for Marcy, the vet, whom Dan called Dr. Lynch, was in the capital. His clinic was private and small. Dan parked his car in the backyard, and he and Marcy went to the appointment together. "Dr. Lynch is in surgery. Wait a bit. He'll be free soon," the woman at the reception desk said at once. Marcy and Dan sat down on a bench in the corridor and waited. The bear cub fiddled in the blanket, then began to grumble and even tried to roar. "You're treating him like a child," Dan muttered, "and for nothing. He's not a man, he's a beast. They grow up fast. Just a little more, and he'll be huge, ready to bite your head off. My brother used to hunt bears, and he felt as if it wasn't he who was hunting the bear, but the bear who was hunting him. One day the bear trapped us. I barely got away, and my brother got half his head blown off in one blow. He's a killing machine, not a kitten or a puppy. Understand it. We'll get the money and forget about him." Marcy listened silently and began to choke. She opened her mouth, trying to gulp at least a little air, waving her hand and bulging her eyes. It was obvious that the girl was in a panic. "What's wrong with you?" Dan asked, worried. "Asthma." The girl barely managed to utter a word. "What should I do?" "An inhaler," Marcy said with difficulty. I need an inhaler. It must have fallen out in the car. Please bring it back soon. It's on the floor. It must be somewhere on the floor." Dan hurriedly left the clinic and made his way to the car, leaving Marcy breathless in the corridor. As soon as she estimated that he had turned the corner of the building, Her breathing returned to normal, and she quickly moved away from the clinic, running in the opposite direction of the parking lot. She didn't have a plan, only a vague idea of how to free the little cub from his tormentors and deceive Dan by pretending she had asthma. The rest was uncertain. Earlier that morning she concocted a repulsive mixture of zucchini, ketchup and roadside mud. She smeared this disgusting mess on the bear and the bottom of the cage. Marcy worried whether the baby would lick it off, but he was smarter than that and didn't touch the foul substance. She presented this mixture as vomit and bloody diarrhea. Deceiving those scoundrels was easy, but now what? Should she find some animal rights activists? But who's to say they would be trustworthy? Marcy had seen news reports about criminals pretending to be anyone, and she also feared they might turn her into the police. It was all very unsettling for her. Initially, Marcy aimlessly walked between buildings trying to get further from the clinic and Dan. She avoided the main road and hardly noticed the weight of the furry baby she tightly held in her hands. But eventually exhaustion set in, and besides the cub started growling hungrily. Marcy bought ready-made baby milk and sat on a bench to feed him. The bear cub was still covered in the grimy mixture she had used to portray his illness. While it happily slurped his food, Marcy surveyed her surroundings. She found herself in an old neighbourhood filled with old buildings. Some windows were boarded up, others were broken or missing entirely. There was not a soul in sight, no children playing or kittens roaming around. The absence of old ladies sitting on benches or people smoking near the driveway was eerie. Feeling unsafe, Marcy decided not to linger in the street and made her way to the entrance of one of the buildings that looked abandoned. The creaking hinges opened the front door, allowing her to enter the building uninvited. What she saw inside was perplexing. Even in the dim light, Marcy could tell that the doors to all the apartments were broken or ajar. Some were wide open, revealing the disarray within. Fear gripped Marcy's legs, making it difficult to move. Suddenly she heard footsteps coming from downstairs. Being on the second floor, Marcy panicked, thinking it might be Dan. In a moment of fear, she rushed into the first apartment she could find. The terrified Marcy stood in the hallway for a moment, then mustered the courage to explore further. Her heart pounded, feeling as if it were held in the icy grip of fear. She cautiously entered the kitchen and was horrified by what she saw. The drawers were intact, but utensils were scattered on the floor, as if there had been a raid or a search. The refrigerator, which had been unplugged, was slightly ajar, emitting a repugnant smell of spoiled food. Suppressing a gag reflex, Marcy ventured into the room. The furniture was broken and belongings were strewn about. What on earth happened here? Marcy nervously wondered, deciding it was best to leave the suspicious apartment. When she went out to the stairwell, she heard those people again. She became afraid and decided to try her luck at the next door. Upon entering the apartment without hindrance, she saw the same scene. All things were in place. Clothes were lying around. It was as if people had been evacuated, rushing. There was even a cup of dried coffee on the table. They were in such a hurry that they didn't take books, photos, cosmetics or furniture. It was terrifying. Marcy found herself in a terribly mystical state, causing her whole body to shake. It felt as if she had entered a parallel world where everything was strange and dangerous. The bear suddenly became unbearably heavy, causing the girl's hands to ache. "Just don't drop it," thought Marcy. Deciding to go up one more floor, Marcy entered another abandoned apartment. To her surprise, it was empty, although the repair work appeared new and expensive. The apartment had light-coloured laminate flooring, light-coloured walls and a mosaic-lined bathroom with a combined toilet. Inside, there was an impressive shower cabin. Apart from a light leather sofa placed in the centre of the large living room, there were no other belongings. On the sofa, there was a crumpled woolen blanket, which was also gorgeous. It was quiet and bright, and Marcy felt a desire to stay in this apartment. As she approached the couch, Marcy grabbed the corner of the blanket and pulled it towards herself. Pulling harder, she suddenly realized that there was a man lying under the covers. He was perfectly still and seemed to be dead. With fear and surprise, the girl let out a loud scream, startling the bear. Suddenly, the man who was lying down stirred, abruptly sat up on the sofa, and looked at Marcy with dazed eyes. He bellowed, "Who are you? I didn't call you." The man looked frightful, with a thick beard and a face that appeared to have been stung by bees. Screaming once again out of fear, Marcy rushed to the door and didn't even notice how she quickly overcame 2 flights of stairs. She thought she heard the sound of footsteps coming after her from downstairs. There was no staircase leading to the attic, and all the apartments on the last floor were closed. In desperation, the girl cried out, "Help!" At that very moment, the door of one of the apartments opened, and a sturdy elderly man appeared on the threshold, wearing a t-shirt, slippers, and colourful trousers. In his hand, he firmly held an axe, which, judging by the expression on the grandfather's face, seemed ready to be used at any moment. "What's wrong?" he asked. "I'm being chased," shouted the girl. "By whom?" "I don't know." "Come into the apartment, quickly," said the grandfather, as he remained standing in the stairwell. "Who's there?" he barked a question to those below. "It's us, Mr. Kosh, us. We're not doing anything wrong," came a high male voice. "Yes, Mr. Kosh, we're not doing anything wrong," echoed another voice. "Well, behave yourself." Mr. Kosh relented, "or I'll deal with you quickly." He entered the apartment and closed the door. "Come in, don't be afraid. These are the local bums," he said to a bewildered Marcy. "What happened, Ben?" asked the elderly woman who appeared from the kitchen. "Oh, Sarah, don't worry. Those fools frightened the girl." The elderly man shrugged. "And why is she running around here?" asked the wife, apparently not intending to address the guest. "Well, we'll ask her that now. Put the kettle on, Sarah." The woman obediently shuffled into the kitchen, and the elderly man gestured for Marcy to follow her. The girl looked around confused. It was an ordinary apartment, clean and cosy, but with old repairs. It was a typical apartment where elderly people lived. "What do you have there, daughter? A dog or something?" asked the man, poking at the grumbling blanket that Marcy clutched to her chest. "Oh, and you won't give me away?" pleaded Marcy. "No, what's the matter? Why are you afraid?" "Oh," sighed the girl, and she spread the blanket on the kitchen floor, revealing a bear cub. The bear, tired of being swaddled, immediately started shaking its head and stretching out its paws. "Bear!" gasped the elderly woman. "Well, not a bear, but a bear cub," the elderly man clarified thoughtfully. "Where did you get it? Did you steal from the zoo?" "Oh, of course not," sighed the girl. "I took him from some very wicked people. They wanted to kill him. His mum was killed, his little brother too, and they wanted to torture him. And also foxes. They almost kidnapped me too. They have all my things." "And where are your parents?" asked the man. "My mother is dead. My sister doesn't care about me, and my father has already gone mad from drinking with my stepmother." "Poor child," sighed the elderly woman. "Well, sit down to drink tea. There's some apricot jam. Here, help yourself." Marcy was starving, so she gladly drank tea with bread and jam. "Tell me," she asked, "what's going on in your house? Why are all the apartments open? Why are things abandoned? As if people were fleeing in panic. What happened? An alien invasion? Some kind of mysticism I don't understand." "Oh, this." The man waved his hand, not stopping to consider the little miracle that was swarming on the floor of his kitchen. "So, it's simple here, no mysticism, just a resettlement." "What?" Marcy didn't understand. "Resettlement," the elderly woman repeated in syllables. "Old houses are being prepared for demolition, and people are being moved into new ones. We are the last ones left. They haven't turned off the water or gas for us yet." "Wow." The girl was surprised. "Why didn't you leave? Were you cheated?"
Well, one apartment we were shown was much better than this one, and the neighbourhood is great, but my wife stubbornly said, "No, I won't go. Let's go to another." Well, they found us another one, even better than the previous one, and again she didn't like it. After a while, they called and invited me to look at the apartment. I was astonished. It was such a great place. But my wife wasn't satisfied again. Now we're waiting for another offer. I suppose we don't die before we can get it. It's greed, Sarah, that's your problem.
Mrs. Koch snorted and said, "You know, one day our grandchildren will live in our apartment. They will inherit it, and I want to do everything possible for them." "I'm sure you'll be lucky," replied the girl kindly, "but still, I don't understand how people left, and even left food on the table and in the refrigerator, and clothes and photos. It's such a mess."
"Don't worry your head," laughed the old man. "People don't need old junk in a new apartment. It won't fit there. And why wash the dishes if you're not going to take it anyway? It's going to be demolished anyway."
"You know, I was in the white apartment. There was a leather sofa with a bum sleeping on it."
"That's Carl."
Mrs. Koch waved her hand. "You shouldn't be afraid of him. He's humble. Yes, he took the apartment. The accountant and her husband used to live there. I don't know what he did for a living, but they lived well. They left the sofa. I don't know why, but Carl is like a king on it. The things scattered around are the work of looters. They're looking for something valuable. The neighbouring apartments are untouched. I don't let them in, but in the neighbouring buildings they've taken away everything in the apartments. Yes, because of my stubbornness, we have to live with homeless people. But we have a deal, and they're like guards. Marginalised people don't touch us, we touch them. Let them take the goods from other people's apartments. People moved out gradually, and if they left something behind, it's because they didn't consider it valuable. But okay, now tell us about your bear." "It's a long story, but he needs to be cleaned and fed." "We'll organise that now," Mrs. Koch rejoiced. She heated some milk and Marcy began to feed the bear from a spoon. The cub grunted with joy, almost like a little piggy. Well, well, take your time, don't be greedy," the old woman scolded the bear cub, as she probably used to say to her grandchildren. Then together they washed the roaring bear cub in warm water. At first the cub tried to bite, but then it got used to the water and calmed down. After the bath, the child of the forest was wrapped in a clean towel and placed in a large basket to dry off and sleep. "It's like labelled," grinned the elderly man, looking at the little guest. "Yes, indeed," smiled Marcy, looking at the dark spot around its eye. "How unusual." "It was not for nothing that you met him on your way, and it was not for nothing that he got you," the man said meaningfully. "Tell me, what do you plan to do next?" "I don't know," sighed the girl. "Where will I take him? I don't trust the zoo. I don't trust zookeepers either." "What zoos?" Mrs. Koch intervened. "He should be released into the wild, into nature. Let him out in the woods. He'll be lost or the hunters will catch him again." The girl shook her head. "No, I can't just let him out in the forest. And it's not just the forest he needs, but his native element." "Then can you help? Can you get in touch with old Alfred?" "It's difficult, but it's all right. Tomorrow I'll go to the post office and give him a telegram," nodded the grandfather confidently. "A telegram?" Marcy was surprised. "Do they still exist?" "Of course. There is no communication where Alfred lives. It's a remote visit. He hasn't got a telephone or internet connection there, but every week he goes to another village to the post office. He'll get a telegram to tell him you're on the way." "On my way? Where to?" gasped the girl. "To him," Mrs. Koch laughed. "To the end of the world." "No, I'm not going." The girl was frightened. "Don't be afraid. It's a magical place, enchanted. When a person is in some trouble, when a person is lost in life, he can come to that village and be healed." "And many people have been healed that way?" asked Marcy. "No, not many, because not everyone is ready to take responsibility for their life. And you, Marcy, don't be afraid. You've been given this cub as a guide. This is your chance, don't miss it.
So, you're going to Alfred? We'll equip you for the journey,
Mr. Koch said confidently. It's embarrassing, Marcy said. I'm nobody to you.
There are no stranger children. It's not for nothing you came into our house. Just think about how many events took place before we met. You're being guided by Providence. You'll go with our son. He's a trucker. He'll take you to one place, then he'll give you to his friend, the gamekeeper, and he will take you to Alfred's village.
The girl realized that there was nothing left for her but to agree to this adventure. For the last couple of days, she had experienced so much that travelling to the unknown lands no longer frightened her.
You, Hugh, don't be silly. Look what a machine I've made for you. Especially for your back and for your leg.
Yes, it's hard and I'm not sure it will help, Hugh protested. It took him 7 sweats to get over the construction the old man had made for him out of improvised materials. But that was not all. The old man treated the young man with stinking ointments and herbal remedies. After a while he began to realize that he saw and thought differently. The world had become much wider and deeper than it was before. The former problems, limitations, and complexes receded into the background.
It's nothing, Alfred repeated. I'll put you on your feet.
Hugh, who had survived the betrayal, liked it here in the wilderness. No fuss, no acquaintances, no social games, only primitive life. And nature was better than any psychotherapist. The experience he gained cannot be overestimated. It came to the point that he even began to feel gratitude towards his wife, because if it were not for her, he would not have gotten to the village and would not have learned wisdom from the old hermit. One day, Alfred and Hugh had a serious conversation about life and the future.
What should I do next? Teach me, Hugh asked. You have to decide for yourself. I'm not your counsellor.
It's so difficult to decide. I like it here, and I'd like to go to civilization.
You'll leave when you think it's necessary,
said the old hermit.
But you're not ready yet. Your body is weak, and your spirit is not strong. The pain in your soul is still there. Until it's cured, don't go.
How will I know when it's time? Asked Hugh.
You'll realise it at the right time.
Will you miss me? Asked the young man with a smile.
Why should I miss you? I'd rather be happy for you, for being married, for having family. Family, kids, work and health. What else do you need?
Wife, children, Hugh said bitterly. My wife betrayed me, treacherously and cruelly. I'm afraid to start a family now. I don't know where to look for a wife.
And you do not look. She will find you, said Alfred confidently.
At that very moment there was a quiet knock at the door.
Come in. Why are you treading on the threshold?
Said the old man. The door creaked open and a young girl entered the room. She appeared to be ordinary, but pretty at the same time. She held a bear cub in her arms, and from the tension in her arms, it seemed the cub was heavy, and she wanted to put him down on the floor. Hugh jumped up from his chair in surprise, and immediately lost the ability to speak. He felt embarrassed and smiled foolishly. The girl herself was also embarrassed, and didn't know what to say. There, she said quietly. I've come.
Well, sit down, since you have come, invited the hermit, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. We'll drink tea. Let him go. Let him go where he wants. He's the master here. The bear is not our guest. On the contrary, we are its guest here in the forest.
Marcy was relieved to let the bear cub go to the floor and shook her tired arms to relax. Thank you for the welcome, she said, and sat down at the table. Hugh immediately began to serve her tea, and to the girl, this tea seemed like the most delicious in the world. It was surprising for Marcy to be in such a wilderness, at the edge of the world, in an old house made of strong logs. However, at the same time, she felt safer and more at home than ever before.
There's a church in the village. We can marry you, if you want,
grinned the hermit, admiring how cheerfully his guests were chatting. Marcy blushed and lowered her eyes, while Hugh glanced reproachfully at the old man, causing him to chuckle beneath his silver beard. The next day, Hugh was building an enclosure for the bear cub, while the old man watched and gave commands. But it's a pity to leave him outside. I'd rather have him in the house, sighed the girl.
He doesn't need to get used to humans. Hugh will make him a warm den and he'll be fine. And don't pick up the cub any more. Don't stroke him. He needs to wean from the smell of humans."
Marcy sighed. It was difficult to part with her dear friend. He had become so tame, and now she had to turn him into a wild animal. Now, all she had to do was feed him and watch him grow into a strong bear, the master of the wild forest. She also had to let go of her resentment and the past, and drop the label of being the daughter of alcoholics. She needed to believe in herself and started living happily. At first, Marcy, like any young girl in her place, missed the internet, social networks and music. But soon she learned to communicate with nature, talk to trees, listen to the music of the wind, and enjoy the singing of birds. Together with Hugh, they went to the forest to pick mushrooms and berries, and the old man taught the girl to look for useful herbs. The bear cub was let out every day to run and play. At first he was afraid to run far from home and always came straight back. He grew quickly, and he wasn't ready to leave for a life in the wild. But each time, his excursions into the forest became longer than the previous ones. Nearly 2 years passed. As promised by Alfred, Hugh was cured of his illnesses and became strong and healthy. There was no sign of his limp anymore. Physical labour had worked wonders. Marcy also let go of the burdens of her past and blossomed, becoming more beautiful. She even found a hobby, pottery. She made such beautiful housewares on the pottery wheel that Hugh was amazed by them. One day, tourists visited the old man's farm. When they saw Marcy's pottery, they bought almost everything. Meanwhile, Hugh finally realised that Alfred was right, and indeed his wife had come to him. He proposed to her, and the girl gladly accepted. They got married in the church that the old man had mentioned. On the same day, when they returned home, they didn't wait for their bear, who had gone into the woods that morning. Well, maybe he'll come back, the newlyweds wondered, but the old man simply shook his head. That's it. He is gone, to conquer his forest. There's no need for him to stay with us. And it's time to leave for both of you. The village has given you everything it could. Live happily, children, and don't worry about me. Others will take your place." From these words, Marcy cried, although she realised that it was really time to say goodbye to the hermit. Hugh jokingly asked, "What about you? Won't you miss us? After all, we've lived together for 2 years." "Why should I miss you?" The hermit was surprised. "I will only be happy for you, that you live well and in harmony. And don't miss me, too. Just be happy for me when you remember me." The newlyweds didn't delay their departure. They bid farewell to the house, nature, and the old man, and set off for their new life. Initially, life wasn't easy for the young couple in the city. They had to adjust to urban life from scratch. Hugh rented the cheapest apartment because he had very little money left from his meagre savings. Marcy had some money from selling pottery, but she spent it on clothes because she wanted to look beautiful in the city. "Here come the social games," Hugh laughed. "The main thing is that our love boat doesn't get wrecked by everyday life." Fortunately, that didn't happen. Hugh quickly resumed doing repairs for customers and started earning a decent income. Marcy initially focused on her creativity, pottery art, and then began combining pottery wheel and studying. Hugh supported her in all her endeavours. One day, while walking down the street, Hugh pointed out an elderly couple to his wife. They walked hand in hand, as if they were young. "Look, isn't it great? I wish we could have that kind of relationship when we're old." Wait, Marcy said thoughtfully, and ran up to the couple. "Oh, Mrs. Koch, Mr. Koch," she exclaimed joyfully. "I'm so happy to meet you." "Marcy!" The old couple rejoiced. "How are you? You look marvellous." "Oh," the young woman sighed, "if you only knew how you influenced my life. And this is my husband, Hugh. By the way, tell me what happened to you. Where are you living now?" "Well, Sarah was right," Mr. Koch said. "They gave us such a gorgeous apartment, it's like a palace. But our grandson complains that parking near us is costly." "Well, I may have gone a little overboard," the old lady admitted and laughed. After saying goodbye, Hugh and Marcy promised themselves that they would do everything to maintain the same kind of relationship when they grew old. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, there was another scene. The phone rang sharp and shrill, catching the men surprised. One of the men roughly nudged Dan in the side.
"Wake up, the boss is calling."
Dan reluctantly picked up the phone.
"Hello? Yes. Bear meat? It's out of season, it's forbidden. The gamekeepers are keeping an eye. Do you have frozen bear meat? The customer wants it fresh." "Oh, I understand. I'll get it, I promise."
Taking their rifles and all the necessary equipment, the poachers got out of the SUV and headed back into the forest. The gloomy trees closed in behind them. A sense of foreboding gripped all 5 members of the team. They wandered through the forest for a long time and suddenly came across a trail. A bear trail.
"Well, that's it. We need to kill the bear so we can return with the spoils, get the money, and live without worries. At least for a while. Let's split up. We have to surround it or it will escape,"
Dan commanded. The poachers scattered, and suddenly a bear's roar and a man's scream was heard from somewhere on the right side, quickly silenced.
"Damn it," whispered one of the hunters. "I don't want this kind of happiness."
He screamed and rushed to flee, but before he could run a few meters, he fell into a wolf pit and was left bleeding, pierced by sharp spikes. Apparently, the gamekeepers hadn't noticed the trap set by other poachers and hadn't removed it in time. The third poacher, like the first, also went after the bear and immediately received a fatal blow. Dan was nervous, fidgeting. He realized that something had happened to his team. He made the trigger ready and began searching for the target amongst the trees. There it was, the beast trying to escape. Dan aimed and pulled the trigger, but the gun didn't fire.
"Oh no," Dan fearfully said, and felt a powerful blow to his head.
The bear didn't torment him, quickly ending with him. Sniffing disdainfully at the dead poacher, it snorted and slowly disappeared into the forest. Its soul was now at peace. The cabin of the old suburban bus was warm, with soft Jansen music playing. Driver Buck whistled a tune he liked, glancing in the mirror at the slumbering passengers. Conductor muttered, "I'm so tired today. I'm exhausted. My legs are falling off. I talk so much during the day, arguing with passengers, that I don't want to open my mouth at home. But at home, I have housework with my son, and my husband wants dinner. I'm so fed up with everything." Buck shook his head. "I don't know. I like my work. I'm honestly telling you. It's all my life on the road. It's so interesting. New people, adventures, no routine and monotony. And Hilda and I have been soul to soul all our lives, like a thread with a needle. We've been through much together. God never gave us children, but that's okay. We are used to it. But we have a summer house. This year, we harvested so many tomatoes and cucumbers. Now, we're starting to pick apples. We're thinking of making homemade juice in the juice maker, without preservatives. We'll treat our friends. And what a greenhouse I made for my Hilda. You should have seen. No complaints about fate. I'll come in the evening and Hilda will serve me hot soup with fresh bread, and I'll kiss her and hug her. Isn't that happiness?" Conductor laughed. "You're a good man and a positive man, Buck. You've described everything so deliciously. I drooled. And really, why am I nagging?" Buck smiled to himself as he thought of his wife. Hilda was the meaning of his life, a faithful friend, counsellor, and beloved woman. They met in their youth at dances. His wife worked as a nurse in a hospital, and it was her calling. She never approached her work formally, and always tried to do everything possible to help the patients recover. Buck couldn't imagine life without the road. It beckoned him like a magnet. He spent his life driving trucks on long trips and earning good money. Hilda faithfully waited for him, worried, prepared sandwiches and coffee for the road, and always greeted him with tears in her eyes. She never once reproached him for choosing a non-family profession. But age took its toll, and it became difficult for Buck to make long-haul trips. So he got a job as a suburban bus driver. Buck and Hilda had always dreamed of having children. They had been through numerous examinations, and there were no abnormalities or serious diseases, but Hilda never gave birth to a child. There were a couple of miscarriages, and that was it. Buck saw how his wife suffered because of this, although she never showed it. He always reassured her that he loved only her and would never leave her. To take care of someone, they got a funny little dog, Bucky. Hilda sewed him overalls and slippers, walked him in the park and bathed him. Bucky faithfully adored his kind masters. And now the man had finished his last trip and was on his way to the bus garage. Outside, the weather had turned bad, with pouring rain and gusts of wind that swayed the tree branches, making it difficult to see anything. Suddenly, as he was leaving the village, he noticed two figures illuminated by the headlights. It was late in the evening, and there was no bus stop. But nevertheless, Buck pressed the brake. Two individuals, seeing the bus stopped, approached it quickly. It was an old man and a young child, around 7 years old, who was limping badly on one leg. What an unusual couple! Where could they be going on foot at such a late hour? Buck thought to himself and opened the door. The drenched wanderers swiftly entered the bus. Despite his limp, the young boy assisted his grandfather and took care of him. The old man remained silent, only gesturing and waving his hands, while pointing at the boy. Finally, the boy spoke. "Hello, sir. Thank you for stopping. We've been trying to hitch a ride for an hour. My name is Spencer, and this is my grandfather, Mr. Robbins, and he's very sick. Seriously ill. We need help." Spencer reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a piece of paper, and handed it to Buck. "Please, help us. Take us to the bank on Green Street. It's a matter of life and death." Buck read the message and looked at the travellers thoughtfully. Suddenly the boy cried out, "Sir, don't leave us here. Help us get to the bank. We really need it." Buck's heart trembled, and he firmly stated, "I'll help you. No problem. My name is Buck, but the bank is closed at night anyway. Let's go to my house, spend the night, and tomorrow morning I'll take you where you need to go." The elderly man raised his hands to the sky, as if in gratitude, and nodded his head. The child also rejoiced and stopped crying, saying, "Yes, thank you. You're so kind. But please, let me take this little puppy with me. I found him behind the bus stop in a cardboard box. Someone must have abandoned it. I can't leave him here. It will starve to death or be tormented by mean boys." Tears welled up in the experienced driver's eyes, and he marvelled. What a small but kind and caring heart. He's in trouble himself, yet he's trying to rescue a puppy. That means a lot. Aloud, the man cheerfully responded, "You're right. We can't leave a friend behind. I have a dog at home too. I love him very much, and I hope my Bucky will become friends with your puppy." Meanwhile, the little puppy timidly peeked out from under the boy's jacket and whimpered. The boy gently stroked its wet fur and whispered, "Don't be afraid, Duke. You're with me now. Everything will be all right. You see, I didn't deceive you. You're my friend now, the most loyal one." Throughout the trip, the elderly man dozed off, and Buck asked the boy, "Why are you limping? Should I take you to the hospital and let the doctors have a look?" The child shook his head and began to explain. "It happened a year ago when I fell off my bike. I had a cast on my leg, but something didn't heal properly according to the doctors. That's why I limp. I don't need to go to the hospital. I have a vital task." When Buck arrived home with his guests and the puppy, Hilda was astonished, blinking repeatedly, but welcomed everyone, saying, "Good evening. What a surprise. Buck, are these your friends? Why didn't you call and let me know? I would have prepared a special dinner. I'll set the table right away. Oh, and who's peeking out from behind your jacket?" The boy said, "I'm Spencer. Grandpa's name is Mr. Robbins, and this is my Duke. He's hungry. I feel so sorry for him." The woman said, "Let's wash him first, otherwise he'll get all the carpets dirty. Come on, Spencer, help me please." In half an hour, everyone enjoyed a delicious dinner, followed by tea and candy. The puppy had already eaten enough of Bucky's food and had been sniffing around on the bed for a while. The dog surprisingly accepted Puppy, sniffed him for a long time, then licked his nose and settled down. Hilda prepared a bed for the guests and hung their belongings to dry. After their adventurous day, Spencer fell asleep as soon as his head touched the pillow, feeling safe. The next morning, Buck had the day off and decided to accompany their new friends to the bank to ensure that Spencer would be heard and not turned away. The bank was located in the town centre, and although it wasn't well known, it had its fair share of clients. At first, they encountered problems with the guard at the entrance. The little kid pleaded, "Let me go directly to the banker. I have a personal matter for him. It's very important." The guard responded angrily, "What kind of circus are you trying to create here? Wait in line like everyone else." Buck decided to intervene. "Excuse us, but this is a complicated case. You see, the elderly man is mute and can't speak, but the boy will explain everything. Please, let us go to her without waiting in line. It's a matter of life and death." The guard waved his hand and took them straight to the head manager, Mr. Rotundi. Once everyone was seated in the office, a stern man with a bald head and glasses asked unhappily, "So, what brings you here? And be quick, I don't have much time." Spencer took out a folder with documents from his backpack and handed it to the manager, saying, "Here, these are all the documents my grandmother gave me. Please give me her money. She kept it here. Grandma's in the hospital and she needs an emergency operation." The banker reluctantly examined the papers for a long time. There was indeed an account number, details, grandmother's passport, and a power of attorney allowing her husband to access the deposit on her behalf. Everything seemed to be in order. However, the manager was hesitant to release a large sum of money as it generated good interest for the bank through loans to other clients. "I won't give you any money now," he said sharply. "Bring Mrs. Robbins here. All of this looks like a fake power of attorney to me. Otherwise, I'll press the panic button, and you'll have to explain yourselves to the police. Have a lovely day. You're free to leave." The upset kid started to cry, tears welling up in his eyes as he protested. "I'm not lying. My grandmother is sick and she needs help. She told me that she's been saving for years. Why don't you believe me?" Buck also stepped in, saying, "Put yourselves in the shoes of those less fortunate. Don't you have any compassion? Especially since the documents are all in order. Why can't they withdraw the money?" The manager called the guard and turning to Buck, he hissed, "Who are you, sir? Why are you so protective of this kid? If it's so urgent, let the account holder come and close it. The conversation is over." There was shouting and Spencer's crying. Nevertheless, the guard ushered everyone out, and Buck questioned the crying boy. "Spencer, why didn't you tell us about your grandmother earlier? Let's go to her. Maybe we can help her ourselves." Through his tears, the boy explained, "My grandmother told me to keep quiet and not tell anyone about the deposit or talk about her. She was worried that thieves or bandits might rob us." Buck took a piece of paper and a pen and gave all this to Mr. Robbins so that he could write the hospital information, and they went to the hospital right away. Unfortunately, they received the sad news. The tired doctor sadly explained, "I'm very sorry to say this, but Mrs. Robbins' heart failure has worsened, probably due to stress, and she has suffered a heart attack. She is now in critical condition in the intensive care unit." Upon hearing this news, the Spencer's grandfather clutched his chest and then collapsed. The nurses quickly placed him on a stretcher, and the doctor ordered, "Take him to the examination room immediately. There appears to be another patient with a heart condition. Give me the man's papers. I think we need to admit him to our department." Spencer cried out and whispered, "Grandpa, hold on. Why are you leaving me alone? Where am I supposed to go now? I don't want to go to Mum. She will beat me again." Hilda, who had arrived at the hospital too, embraced the boy, pulling him close and stroking his head, trying to calm him down. "Don't cry, Spencer. No one is going to leave you. You will come with us and stay for a while. Grandpa needs to get better too. You can see how weak he is. We will visit him and try to help your grandmother." Buck took the doctor aside and asked, "Tell me honestly, how much money is needed for the operation and treatment? We don't have much at the moment, but I really want to help the poor boy and save his grandmother." The doctor didn't try to sugarcoat the situation and replied, "I don't know how her body will respond, but the situation is very difficult, especially considering her age. She's already over 80, but we can't delay it any longer. I'm not even sure how she will tolerate such a difficult surgery, but it's worth a try. Excuse me, I'll be right back. Her husband is also in poor health. We need to help him." Buck and Hilda, being simple people with limited means, started calling their acquaintances and loyal friends for help. Through their collective efforts, they managed to raise the necessary funds for the operation. They were overjoyed, especially Spencer, who held on to the hope that his grandparents would recover soon. However, the miracle did not happen. Buck and Hilda were only half a day too late. When they rushed to the hospital to inform the doctor that they had the money and could schedule the operation, it was already too late. Mrs. Robbins had passed away. This news was a devastating blow to everyone, especially Spencer. He sobbed uncontrollably, burying his face in Hilda's shoulder, and shouted, "It's all that bad sir's fault. If he had given grandmother's money in time, she'd still be alive. I hate him! I hate him!" But the troubles didn't end there. 3 days later, Mr. Robbins also passed away, joining his wife in heaven. Spencer was filled with sorrow and became withdrawn. Hilda did her best to comfort him and then gently asked, "Spencer, where are your parents? We need to inform them about the deaths of your grandparents. They will want to say their goodbyes and arrange their burial. Where do you live?" However, at the mention of his parents, the boy became restless and replied, "We live in the village. My mum drinks a lot and then she fights. My grandparents often got into trouble because of her. She pulls me by my ear and calls me a lazy bastard. And my dad is in jail. I don't want to go home. Don't send me back. I'll run away anyway. Mummy is mean and she doesn't like anyone. She hated Grandma and Grandpa. She took away their pensions and beat them." Spencer covered his face with his hands and sobbed inconsolably, saying, "Nobody needs me in Duke. Only Grandma and Grandpa loved me, and Mummy doesn't need me." Hilda felt immense pity for this poor little boy who had lost the two most important people in his life. She held him tightly and whispered, "Don't say that, Spencer. We need you and little Duke. We don't have children of our own, but we will love you and won't give you to anyone. Look, Duke likes to live here too. He and Bucky are friends now. They even sleep on the same bed." Spencer looked at Hilda with tears in his big blue eyes and asked, "Are you really not going to leave me? I promise to behave and not be spoiled. I even know how to fry potatoes and wash the floor." Hilda was astonished by the amount of sorrow that this little boy had experienced and replied, "Spencer, children shouldn't wash the floor. They should play, learn and enjoy life. That's what childhood is for. Don't worry, Buck and I are here. Everything will be fine. You'll see." Hilda and Buck consulted each other and decided to find out everything to be themselves. What if the child is in shock after the death of his beloved grandparents? Maybe he is just resentful towards his mother, and perhaps it's not as bad as it seems. It was difficult to believe that a mother could be so terrible that her child would hate her and not want to live with her. Unbelievable. Buck sensibly thought that if the family was dysfunctional, then the local police officer must be a frequent visitor at their house. The man decided to speak with him first and immediately went to meet him at the local police station. Paul listened attentively to Buck and sighed heavily. "I'm so sorry about Mr. and Mrs. Robbins. They were such decent people. Mrs. Robbins was a local teacher, retired long ago. She taught me and even my children math. Mr. Robbins was a locksmith with golden hands. But their daughter is something. Since childhood, she's been nothing but trouble. First, fights with other kids. Then, running away from home. And then, starting from the age of 15, getting into all sorts of mischief. She ran away to the city and came back with a boyfriend and pregnant. His name was Tony. Her parents arranged a wedding for them and they could live in peace. But Megan was never satisfied. She had a craving for trouble. She started drinking and taking something, neglected Spencer, and was seen with strange men. Tony became terribly jealous of her, so he started drinking too. And then, once being drunk, he beat her suitor to death. They put him in jail, and he'll be there for a long time. And after that, Megan completely lost control. Mrs. Robbins often complained to me, hiding the beatings under her sweaters. I scared Megan more than once. I visited them often, warning her that Spencer would be taken away and placed in an orphanage. But she didn't care. She just kept saying, "Let them take him away. Tony's brat. I don't need him for anything. I didn't even want him." Buck shook his head. He was shocked by the hell that Spencer had been enduring all these years. Meanwhile, the policeman said, "Well, let's go and visit the grieving daughter. We need to inform her about her parents' death. Maybe her conscience will finally awaken, and she'll start acting more responsibly." They went to the once well-maintained but now neglected house. The windows were covered in dirt, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. The policeman knocked on the window for a long time before he heard a hoarse voice say, "Who's there?" Paul sternly shouted, "Open up, Megan, it's the policeman. Hurry up. Did you drink again last night with your friends? Where is your son? Don't you care at all?" A fat, dishevelled and grumpy woman appeared on the doorstep. She reeked of sweat and alcohol. Buck recoiled, feeling almost sick. Megan looked at them with a cloudy, not quite sober gaze, and reluctantly replied, "What do you want?" "Well, we had a few drinks last night. It was my friend's birthday. What's wrong with that? And Spencer and his grandfather have gone somewhere." Paul responded sharply, "Megan, shame on you. While you're drinking, your parents died in the hospital, and your son is an orphan with a mother who's still alive." The woman hiccuped and angrily retorted, "Huh? But I haven't any money to bury them. Let the state take care of it. And I'll take Spencer, of course. I'll get an allowance for him. I won't be receiving my parents' pension anymore, so I need something to live on." Buck looked at the police officer, and without words, he understood. He frightened Megan by saying, "You'll never get Spencer back. He is still in the orphanage. You dumped everything on his elderly grandmother and his sick grandfather, and now you won't even try." The woman suddenly grinned and shouted, "Oh, really? Well then get out of here and bury them yourself, and I'll take Spencer anyway." Buck was horrified and said to Paul, "What kind of mother is this? She doesn't even look like a woman. Listen, Spencer is afraid of her and hates her. He begs us not to leave him. We may not be rich, but we're decent people. We love the boy as if he were our own. How could we adopt him? Can you imagine what will happen to him if Megan takes him? What will Spencer grow up to be? A criminal, an alcoholic? We will bury Mrs. and Mr. Robbins ourselves, with all due respect, since their own daughter doesn't care about them." The policeman sighed heavily and replied, "You're right about everything. We can't return the boy to this troubled mother. I'll try to help you. I'll gather testimonies from all the villagers. Meanwhile, you should collect the necessary adoption documents and work towards revoking Megan's maternal rights. She doesn't need Spencer for anything other than the child allowance. I'll do what I can to assist with the funeral. They should be buried in their native village, where they lived their whole lives. I'll organise a funeral service in the church, and we'll hold a wake in the canteen to honour them. Thank you, Buck, for caring so much about them and about Spencer. I'm surprised you're not even related to them. It's a rare thing these days." Buck hesitated and replied quietly, "We're all human beings. We all walk under God. Hilda and I were not blessed with children of our own, and it appears that Spencer was left to us as a son or a grandson. I believe there are no chance meetings. The policeman took care of everything, and the elderly couple were laid to rest properly. Half the village attended the wake. As everyone began to leave the cemetery, Megan appeared. She sobbed and wrung her hands, but the villagers looked at her with disapproval. Spencer saw his mother and immediately hid behind Hilda's back. But Megan saw her son and stumbled towards him, spreading her arms and shouting in a slurred voice, "Spencer, my son! So you're not in an orphanage. Come to your mummy. I missed you so much." "I don't want to. You're bad. You don't love me. I'll live with Hilda. She is kind and won't abandon me." Megan became furious upon hearing her son's words. Like a madwoman, she threw herself at Spencer, saying, "Hey, you little brat! I'm not going to repeat twice. Go home!" Then Megan turned to Hilda and hissed, "And who are you? Why are you playing Mother Teresa? What do you want with my son? You're counting on his allowance, aren't you? Give me Spencer, or I'll pull your hair out." She stepped to grab Hilda's hair, but Buck and the villagers quickly intervened, pulling Megan away. The district officer escorted her away from the cemetery, saying, "Go away and don't embarrass yourself. You're completely drunk. Aren't you ashamed? You can't afford the funeral, but you have money for drink." The drunken woman spewed curses. Decency, love and care had long been erased from her intoxicated mind. She always felt that her parents hindered her from living life the way she wanted. She also didn't want a son. He was a nuisance to her, demanding attention and affection. But now, when she realized that he could be taken away, she suddenly felt resentful. Who gave them the right? But nevertheless, Buck and Hilda managed to get custody of Spencer. They collected all the necessary documents with the help of the district police officer. The villagers also supported them by saying that Megan was an unfit mother and a drunkard who couldn't be trusted with a child. As a result, Megan was deprived of her parental rights in the trial. Hilda and Buck adopted Spencer and started raising him as their own son, even though they were already in old age and the boy resembled a grandson to them. The money that Hilda and Buck collected for Mrs. Robin's operation, they decided to use for Spencer. They wanted to have him examined and get his leg treated. The boy longed to be like everyone else, to jump and run carefree, ride a bicycle and play soccer with his friends. The doctor reassured them, but also warned that the treatment would be long and stretch over several months. But Spencer was willing to endure it all, just to become healthy again. Hilda and Buck supported him, not letting him lose hope, even when his leg was very painful after the operation. Faithful Duke was always by his side, sensing how difficult it was for his young master. The dog faithfully licked his hands and curled up on his knees, resting his head on his belly and barking playfully. Spencer adored his dog, hugging him tightly and teaching him commands. Duke was his most loyal and devoted friend. And the boy was also pleased in his new family. He finally learned what it was like to live in a family where there was no scolding, scandals, drunkenness, or bullying. No one offended anyone. He idolized Hilda. She cooked deliciously, did a lot with him, and took care of him. They had conversations, read fairy tales, and children's encyclopedias together. The boy dressed and groomed well, just like ordinary kids. After 3 months, his leg healed with the help of physical therapy and massages, and Spencer began to walk normally. Buck enrolled him in the swimming pool, where the kid had a lot of fun. He loved being in the water, swimming and diving for hours. He hardly remembered his mother, Megan, as he was so content and calm in his new family, as if he was born there. He often visited his grandparents' grave with Buck. Duke, the skinny little puppy, had grown into a large, beautiful dog with brown hair, but he still liked to climb onto his master's lap, even though he didn't fit there anymore. It was touching when Spencer stroked and scratched him behind the ear, whispering, "Duke, my little friend, I love you so much." Buck and Hilda even seemed to have grown younger themselves, because now there was someone to live for. Hilda was radiant when she spent time with Spencer. When he named her mother and sought her advice. The boy turned out to be very clever, excelling in his studies, and on weekends they all spent time together at the summer house. Spencer grew accustomed to work from an early age and eagerly helped in the vegetable garden. He skillfully weeded flowers and carrots, assisted his new mother with watering, and found joy in it all. The boy especially enjoyed grilling kebabs and baking potatoes in the yard with his foster father. It brought him great delight. Spencer always took on an important role turning the meat. The dogs also had a lot of fun there. They ran freely, digging the ground, lying amusingly in the sand, and raced to fetch sticks with their teeth. Life continued as usual. However, Megan never settled down. She kept drinking and held a grudge against her son, considering him a traitor. She fiercely hated the family that took him away. One day, as usual, the local police officer arrived to disperse the drunken company at her house. He scolded the vicious woman and said in his heart, "Megan, you have no sense of responsibility. Hilda and Buck are raising your son. Your parents were buried with their own money, and not a penny was withdrawn from Mrs. Robbins' bank deposit. And you continue to drink and don't care. Who do you think you are?" Megan's eyes greedily lit up. "What deposit?" she asked. "Does my mother have money in the bank? Why don't I know about this? I live here impoverished, struggling to get by, while there is a deposit in the bank." The policeman waved his hand and said, "Get a job, you're a healthy woman. Then you'll have money. Smarten up. I won't tell you anything more." Paul restored order, calmed the neighbours, and left, while Megan pondered intensely. She began rummaging through her late mother's belongings and documents, searching for any clue to find out where her mother kept the money. The woman was determined to get the deposit at any cost. Suddenly it occurred to her that her deceased father must have taken the documents when he left, and now all the papers were in Buck's house. A plan matured in the mind of the foolish mother. She cleaned herself up and went to town. She bought a cheap toy car and began watching the house. During the trial, she heard exactly where her son now lived. Megan hid on a bench in the public garden and started waiting. Finally, she saw the car pull up. Buck dropped Spencer off and drove away. The boy went into the entrance, and Megan rushed after him and traced which apartment the boy had entered. She listened, and it was quiet, indicating that Spencer was alone. Megan saw this as an opportunity, and she rang the doorbell firmly. The naive boy didn't even look through the peephole and immediately opened the door. He was frightened and recoiled upon seeing his own mother. He asked, "Mum, why did you come here?" Inside, Megan felt anger surging through her, realizing that her son was clearly not happy to see her. However, she restrained herself and forced a luscious smile, saying, "Well, hello, Sonny. I missed you so much. Are you alone at home?" Spencer honestly answered, "Yes, alone. Hilda went for a walk with the dogs and will be back soon. And Buck went to the gas station. Why did you come here?" Megan didn't listen further. She shook the boy and sharply asked, "Tell me now, where are the grandfather's documents?" The boy, very frightened, blurted out, "Daddy's room. And why do you need them? Grandpa's dead. What are you up to? Go away. Why did you come here?" Without paying attention to his words, Megan locked him in the bathroom and propped the door open with a chair. Then she rushed to the bedroom, searching for the documents she needed, and quickly found them in the closet, in a prominent place. Megan grinned and ran away, not paying attention to the crying Spencer. The boy kept pounding his fists on the door and shouting, "Open up! Mum! Open the door, I'm scared! What are you doing there? Why did you come here?" Megan only shouted back as she ran away, "Nothing! Sit down and think about how you betrayed your mother. I'm doing what I need to." In 20 minutes, Hilda came back from her walk with the dogs. They were tearing off their leashes and barking frantically, sensing the presence of a stranger. The woman didn't understand what had happened. The door was open, but she heard Spencer crying, "Mummy, is that you? Duke, Bucky, open the door, I'm in the bathroom." Hilda rushed to the bathroom and let her son out. He immediately threw himself on her neck and began to sob. She comforted him and asked, "Sonny, don't cry. You were scared, my little one, but everything is over now. What happened? Who came? Were we robbed?" Spencer told her everything, sobbing. "You won't scold me for opening the door, right? I thought Mum missed me, so she found me. I was surprised, but she locked me up and searched for Grandpa's papers in your bedroom. She's mean. She doesn't like me. I'm afraid of her." Hilda immediately called Buck, who rushed home urgently. They examined everything and found that everything seemed to be in place, except for Mr. Robbins's documents from the bank. The man sadly concluded, "Well, it's clear to me. Megan got wind of the money in the bank and decided to take it for herself. I'll call the district police officer now and inform the police. Let them teach her a lesson. Don't worry, son. She won't be here again." While Buck made calls, Megan managed to withdraw the contribution of her mother by some miracle. Now no one could find her. The incident remained deeply ingrained in little Spencer's memory, and his resentment towards his mother carried on throughout his life. He successfully graduated from school with a focus on mathematics and entered the university. He studied economics and banking and received an increased scholarship. Soon, his first love also entered his life. Spencer, along with Duke and Bucky, enjoyed going for a jog in the park early in the morning when the whole city was still asleep. It was there that he met Kathy, a cute student from a pedagogical college, who also jogged in the mornings. For a long time, Spencer was modest and shy, afraid to talk to her. He simply admired the slim, flexible body and luxurious long hair of this charming brunette. Their introduction was facilitated by the friendly and huge Duke. The dog caught up with the young runner, wagged his tail and rubbed his nose against her. She stroked him and laughed, saying, "What a good dog! What's your name, my friend? Too bad I don't have any treats, or I would give you one." Spencer immediately replied, "This is Duke, my faithful friend. I raised him from a little puppy, and this is small Bucky, also my pet. And my name is Spencer. I live nearby." The girl smiled and said, "That means we're neighbours, because I also live not far from here. My name is Kathy. Nice to meet you." Spencer had made up his mind and said, "I'd like to meet you tonight because I really like you. Can we go to the movies or a concert? Or maybe just go for a walk? Do you mind?" The girl was pleased and replied, "I have a better offer. Come visit today for my sister's birthday. She's 12 years old and we're having a fun gathering with contests and karaoke. I'll be waiting for you at 8. Spencer felt embarrassed and said, "I don't know, it's embarrassing. I don't know your sister at all. Maybe she won't be glad to see me." Kathy laughed and reassured him, "Oh no, don't worry. Jenny is happy to have guests. Every visit is a huge holiday for her. When you come, you'll find out why." Spencer brought flowers and a set of girls' cosmetics as a gift. He went to visit, feeling nervous and anxious about the people he would meet and how he would be received. But for the sake of being with Kathy, he was ready for anything. She had deeply touched his soul. Exactly at 6, Spencer knocked on the door. Kathy opened it looking beautiful, with her flowing hair and minimal makeup. Spencer entered the room and asked, "Hello, where's the birthday girl? I want to congratulate her." To his surprise, a cute little girl came to greet him while sitting in a wheelchair. She listened to the congratulations with embarrassment and gladly accepted the gift. Then she squinted and asked, "So, you're Kathy's fiancé, right? She's so secretive that she doesn't tell us anything. Sit down at the table, I'll introduce you to everyone. They are mostly Kathy's friends, but they're all very nice. Hardly anyone comes to see me. If it weren't for my sister, I'd go crazy." The holiday was fun and relaxed. Spencer quickly made friends with everyone and participated in contests. Only at the end of the evening, when he was alone with Kathy in the kitchen, did he quietly ask, "And what about Jenny? Has she been sick since childhood? She's such a good girl, I feel sorry for her." Kathy sighed and explained, "No, Jenny used to do gymnastics and was very promising. She even had potential to compete. but she had an unfortunate accident during practice and suffered a spinal injury. We've taken her to many doctors, and they all say she needs time and expensive treatment. So we are now collecting money with the whole family and friends. I must help her because I adore Jenny and believe she will walk again." Spencer praised Kathy, saying, "You're very kind. I also had a severe limp as a child because my leg didn't properly heal, so I know how terrible it is to be looked down upon and pitied. My adoptive parents helped me a lot, and I'm grateful to them. Otherwise I would have limped my whole life. So I won't stand by either. I'll help in any way I can." From that day on, Kathy and Spencer began dating, and their tender and caring relationship lasted for years. Spencer introduced his fiancée to Hilda and Buck, who upon learning about Jenny's situation also contributed to raising money. With the support of their loved ones, they managed to raise the necessary funds for Jenny's treatment, and finally the courageous girl regained her ability to walk. Time flew by, and Spencer graduated from the university. He got a job as a junior manager at the very bank where he was refused to get his grandmother's money. The head of the bank, Mr. Rotundi, who was still the same unpleasant and grouchy man with glasses, did not recognize the young specialist as the same boy who had once asked him for money, and meanwhile Spencer had his own plan. The young man dedicated himself to his work, excelling in his role and swiftly climbing the career ladder, and at the same time he collected evidence of the head's misconduct, uncovering his dark schemes and manipulations. Spencer meticulously made copies of the evidence and compiled them in a black folder. A year later, Spencer resolutely took the folder to the prosecutor's office. The whole chain of manipulations was unravelled, and many dishonest people were deprived of their positions. As a result of his bravery and integrity, Spencer was appointed manager because at that time he was the most successful worker in the bank. Mr. Rotundi was furious and shouted in Spencer's face, "Where did you come from? Why did I hire you in the first place? Are you the most honest here? Or do you not need money?" Spencer looked intently at the manager and replied, "You don't recognize me, right? Many years ago I came to your bank with a mute grandfather begging you to give me my grandmother's deposit. There was a scandal then, don't you remember? You refused me, threw me out, even though I had all the necessary documents. But you violated the instructions and treated me like a worthless kitten. My grandmother died all because of you, and my grandfather died soon after." The manager turned pale and sat down in his chair, remembering the incident. He began to apologize, saying, "So that's it. You grew up and decided to take revenge on me, did you? I didn't want to release the money from circulation. I repent. It was a substantial amount, but I never thought someone would die because of it. I'm sorry. Can I make it up to you? I'll give you the money. Just take back your statement." Spencer laughed and said, "You know what? I'm actually grateful to you in a way. Your despicable act motivated me to study and work at the bank. I decided not to seek revenge, but to restore justice. People like you, greedy for other people's money, shouldn't ruin lives. Now the police will sort it out. Please leave my office. Have a nice day." The ex-head fidgeted in his chair, realizing that he had burned all his bridges. He tried to soften the situation, saying, "But listen, Spencer, a woman named Megan Robbins came later and claimed that deposit, so technically your family got all the money. Don't be so hot-headed. Take back your statement." Spencer clapped his hands and replied, "Bravo! You've just confessed to another fraud. And how did she get the money? If she had the power of attorney for my grandfather, my mother had nothing to do with it. That's the answer because you took a fee from her, a part of the deposit, didn't you? Mr. Rotundi, you will be held legally responsible for everything. If only you knew how much I hated you throughout my childhood, and how I dreamed of retribution. Well, it has happened. I will change everything here. No more black schemes and fraud. Everything will be fair." The ex-head of the bank was prosecuted for fraud and sentenced to a long prison term. Spencer became the head manager. Kathy also graduated from college and became a history teacher at a school. At their wedding, happy Hilda and Buck sat at the festive table and quietly cried with emotion and joy as they watched the newlyweds dance a waltz. Buck whispered to his spouse, "What a wonderful son we have raised, Hilda. Handsome, clever, a sportsman, our pride. It's wonderful how we crossed paths with Spencer on the road." Hilda held her beloved man tighter and said, "That's right, Buck. We have lived a long life together and stopped dreaming of having children. We were both over 50, but it seems fate took pity on us and brought Spencer into our lives. And look how many years have passed. I was thinking, Buck, let's move to the countryside for good. We have chickens and our own vegetable garden. Maybe our grandchildren will be visiting us if we're still here." Buck hugged his faithful wife and replied, "I'm all for it. I've long dreamed of having an apiary, at least a couple of beehives. I've read so much literature and I really want to try this, especially now that we're retired. I'm so lucky to have you, Hilda. No one has ever understood me like you have." And so they did. They took Duke, an old blind Bucky, and moved to the countryside. Buck diligently learned about beekeeping from the local beekeepers and didn't forget to help Hilda. They worked on their new life, slowly but happily. Spencer and Kathy had a long-standing tradition of visiting their family on weekends. One day Hilda overworked herself and fell ill, experiencing severe back pain that made it impossible for her to straighten up. Concerned, Spencer took her to the hospital, where Hilary, an old acquaintance of Hilda, worked in the emergency room. As Hilary attended to Hilda, she shared the latest gossip. "The doctor will examine you now, including x-rays and a CT scan if necessary. However, it's most likely just aggravated rheumatism. Your son is worrying about nothing." Despite the pain, Hilda smiled and replied, "I know, it's not the first time, but Spencer is a caring son. He rushes me to the hospital and buys me medications and vitamins before I even have a chance to complain." Hilary remarked, "You're lucky, Hilda. By the way, I completely forgot to tell you that in our department, in the 5th Ward, Spencer's bio mother lies with a fracture. It's scary. Just horrible. She looks like a homeless woman. It's a good thing you adopted the boy, or he could have ended up like her." Spencer overheard the conversation but kept it to himself. However, when Hilda was taken for an x-ray, he couldn't resist and peeked into that very 5th Ward. He was horrified to see an elderly woman with deep wrinkles and dishevelled grey hair. Her gaze was angry and unpleasant. She stared at him intently and muttered, not recognising her own son, "What are you looking at?" Spencer shuddered and replied, "I'm sorry, I must have mistaken the ward." He left, closed his eyes, and memories of childhood beatings and slaps flooded his mind. He could only hear the phrase, "Tony's brat," echoing in his ears. He also remembered his beloved grandparent, whom his mother terribly treated. The woman in the 5th Ward only evoked disgust and repulsion in his soul. When they brought Hilda back from the x-ray room, Spencer immediately rushed to her and anxiously asked, "How are you, Mum? What did the x-ray show? What did the doctor say?" Hilda reassured him, saying, "Don't worry, sweetheart, it's just rheumatism. I must have strained myself and caught a cold. The doctor prescribed ointments and injections and let me go home." Spencer sat down next to her, kissed the hands that once comforted him in childhood, and tenderly said, "Thank God, I was so worried about you. You are the closest and most beloved person to me, along with Dad. Let's go home now and no gardening for today." Hilda cried, feeling a sense of relief in her soul. Even her back seemed to hurt less. She whispered to him, "Thank you, my dear, for finding and choosing us, for making us so happy. We love you too. I promise I won't do any weeding today." Spencer helped his mother get comfortable in the car, placing a pillow under her aching back. Then he returned to the hospital for a moment. He handed Hilary some money and whispered,
This is for the patient from the 5th ward."
The woman questioned, "Your mother? You should have given it to her yourself." Spencer furrowed his brow and replied, "My mother is in the car. This is for a woman in the 5th ward." He turned around and left without looking back. Hilary sighed and thought, "Well, of course, this is not a mother who gave birth, but the one who stayed up all night, cared for and loved. That's the law of life." Throughout the journey, Spencer couldn't shake the image of his biological mother's puffy, dark, drunken face. He thought to himself, "How fortunate I am to have Hilda as my mum. Otherwise, I wouldn't have grown up into a good person with a mum like that." The next day, Spencer went to the village to visit his grandparents' graves. He spent an hour tidying up the cemetery. Afterward, he sat on a bench, sighed softly, and gazed at the photo of his grandparents. "Grandma, Grandad, it's such a pity that you left this world so soon. I would have made you the happiest. You loved me so sincerely. Let me tell you a story." And he shared the story of his encounter with his birth mother, expressing all his emotions and his profound love for Hilda. Suddenly, the world seemed bright again, and even the sun peeked out from behind the clouds. Grandma listened, happy for her grandson. "And aren't you afraid of this inflatable mattress hanging above the ground?" Sean, Brian's buddy, pushed him on the shoulder as soon as he landed. "He who fears the wolf should not enter the forest," Brian grinned, laying the paraglider on the grass so that it could be collected without tangling the slings. Brian and Sean had been taking tourists on extreme tours to the mountains for 5 years. The guys had already tried everything that could tickle their nerves and make them shake. Rafting, rope jumping, mountain bikes, long hikes, mountaineering. But what interested Brian the most was paragliding. He spent almost the whole summer in the mountains, flying, trying, learning, getting hurt when landing. Once he dislocated his elbow when he caught his paraglider on a tree and fell from a couple of meters high. However, the air, freedom, and the charm of the mountains beckoned the stubborn guy, who flew where others were afraid, and stayed under the clouds for so long that his fingers began to numb from the cold. Brian started taking tourists when he was already convinced of his own skills. Sean was the driver and organizer. Brian was the coordinator and implementer of extreme entertainment. "Oh, Brian, finish your extreme stuff. If you fall from such a high, you'll die," scolded his mother, Mrs. Saylor. But the guy liked to live like that. It was 100 times better than sitting in a stuffy office and poking at buttons. Dangerous? Yes, so what? Someone sneezing in a public place is more dangerous these days. So now I can't go out? Of course not. You have a great education. Go to the bank, make a career, his mother persisted. And when the kids come, will you go to the mountains too? No wife, no kids either, Mum. Why are you bothering me again? Brian sighed tiredly. Talks about the dangers of paragliding and the lack of seriousness in the tourist business repeated regularly, even though it brought him decent money. Brian met Whitney on a social network. He was bored one winter evening, flipping through the newsfeed when he came across the page of a pretty girl. They went on a couple of dates and the girl was impressed by Brian's boldness and passion. Later, he took her on several trips, even offered to ride on a paraglider, but the cowardly Whitney refused. Everything happened quickly, and less than 9 months later he proposed to her. Brian wasn't bothered by the fact that his chosen one was quite spoiled and capricious. At least she always waited for him at home and didn't criticise his hobby. The man was grateful for that and didn't mind that Whitney wasn't working. "Let her do what she likes," he said to his mother. "I earn enough for both of us." Meanwhile, life was flowing at its own pace. Brian and his wife had been living together for a year and a half. Brian's mother gave the couple her 2-bedroom apartment, and she bought a small house in the countryside with her savings. She moved in with the condition that grandchildren would soon follow. Brian laughed, and Whitney rolled her eyes. Children were not in her plans for the next 100 years. Despite warnings that Brian's hobby of flying would not end well, fate had other plans. On their way back from the mountains in late August, the weather was rainy and gloomy. Sean drove the minibus with extreme caution, slowing down at the turns of the Serpentine Road. Brian, tired from the busy programme and early wake-up, dozed off in the passenger seat. Everything changed instantly when a reckless local driver suddenly appeared on the opposite side of the road. Sean turned the steering wheel to avoid a collision, causing the minibus to tip over and crash into a pillar and concrete barrier. Brian was trapped, squeezed almost in half between the roof and the dashboard. Fortunately, the other passengers suffered minor injuries, such as abrasions, bruises, and a few broken fingers. Sean dislocated his arm and got a concussion. It took the emergency services almost 40 minutes to rescue the unconscious Brian. He was urgently sent to the capital of the region, where he had at least a chance to stay alive. The operation was successful, but Brian was left paralysed below the waist. The accident not only took away Brian's mobility, but also his beloved job. Whitney mourned the loss of her beautiful and comfortable life. Her perception of Brian changed almost immediately. No longer seeing him as a hero, of a source of support and leadership, she now viewed him as a burden. Brian experienced a prolonged crisis of mobility loss and fell into a state of depression. The doctor prescribed a set of exercises for Brian, which should have had a positive effect over time. However, due to his frustration and helplessness, he struggled to start doing them. Brian greeted his wife, who had returned from work. But Whitney was not in a good mood. Lately, this state had become the norm for her. She had to wake up early, work, do household chores, and still take care of her disabled husband. "How was your day?" Brian asked, struggling to take the bag of groceries from her. "Disgusting," Whitney sharply replied, taking off her coat. Brian went to the door, placed the bag with groceries on the floor near the refrigerator, and opened the door. "Give me that, otherwise you'll definitely be dropping something." Whitney grabbed the milk out of his hand. "Why are you so rude?" Brian looked at her reproachfully. "And who would clean it up then? You?" Whitney hissed. She felt irritated with her obliging husband. He understood his limitations and tried not to create unnecessary inconvenience for his wife. At first, Brian felt ashamed, but later he accepted his condition and stopped tormenting himself with guilt. "There are some cooked meatballs in the bag. Heat them up yourself. I'm tired." Whitney clenched her temples with her hands and went into her bedroom. She sat down on the edge of the bed, feeling exhausted, lethargic and drained. This was not the life she had envisioned when she married the handsome, athletic and adventurous Brian. But now he was deprived of his hobby and income, and she had to work for both of them, running all over the city, showing cheap apartments to poor families. This was not how Whitney planned to spend her young age. Her husband had already been in the wheelchair for 6 months. At first, they lived off their savings, but they soon ran out. Whitney kept putting off looking for a job. At the age of 25, she had no significant work experience. She did a part-time model for online clothing stores and ran a blog as a stylist, despite having a good education in the hospitality industry. Whitney's real estate business was not going well. Everything about it irritated her from the very beginning. Difficult people, confusing payment processes, running around, countless phone calls, and the need to persuade someone and bend over backward. What kept her in such an unsuitable position? The charming director and owner of the agency. Whitney fell under Ned's charms when she stopped believing in the doctor's optimistic predictions about her husband. There was a constant struggle in Whitney's head between duty, feelings, selfishness and conscience. And tonight, selfishness and inner desires triumphed. Whitney finally realised that she no longer cared about others' opinions, that she didn't want to support her disabled husband until retirement and erase her entire life. She deserved happiness too, the joy of being a woman, not a workhorse burdened with responsibilities. The decision came instantly. "Are you going somewhere?" Brian asked, watching his wife pack the bag with their belongings. "Yes," Whitney nodded briefly. "We're going to your mum's." Brian raised an eyebrow in surprise and smiled slightly. What kind of nonsense is this? The daughter-in-law wants to go to her mother-in-law's house? "I can't take it anymore. Do you understand? I can't. I'm beautiful, young. I want romance. I want to see a decent man beside me. I want care and affection, not to look after an invalid." "Whitney, I'll get out of the wheelchair," Brian interrupted her. "The doctors said there's a chance." "But maybe you won't get up. I'm fed up." Whitney threw several more t-shirts into the bag and zipped up the zipper with a precise movement. "You're staying at your mother's. We need to live apart at least for a few months. 6 months, I don't know." It was a frosty morning in the village. Sparrows chirped cheerfully as they hopped around. The ground was covered in hoarfrost. Whitney opened the gate and pushed the wheelchair along the narrow path to the porch. Brian's mother appeared at the door, wearing a down shawl. "Are you here for long, Whitney?" asked Mrs. Saylor, brushing off invisible snowflakes from her son's jacket. "Brian will be here for a while, but I am returning to the city. I need to work," replied Whitney curtly. Before Mrs. Saylor could respond, Whitney said her goodbyes, closed the door and got back to the cab. 2 months had passed, and the end of March was approaching. During this time, Whitney never returned for Brian. Initially, he called and messaged her himself, but over time, his wife stopped answering the phone and responded curtly on social media. Brian realized that she had abandoned him, callously and without any remorse. His mother shook her head, concerned about the apartment her son had left behind. "Well done, Whitney," lamented Mrs. Saylor. "She burdened me with your husband, and now she lives in my apartment without a care in the world. Brian, file for divorce, I'm telling you." "Mum, everything will work out, just stop it." Brian waved off his mother's insistence, but his belief in his own words dwindled with each passing day. Apathy and longing consumed Brian. He struggled with his own helplessness, unable to perform most of the household chores. Walks became infrequent, as it was difficult to navigate the wheelchair down a couple of porch steps. Once, when Mrs. Saylor was struggling with the wheelchair, her elderly neighbour, Mr. Dunkelman, peered over the fence. "Oh, Mrs. Saylor, why are you carrying him?" the old man shouted indignantly in his straightforward manner. "Hello, Mr. Dunkelman," the woman greeted. "Well, how else can we do it? Can you help instead of wagging your tongue?" The neighbour, agile and far from senile, quickly came up and helped lower the wheelchair down the steps. At the same time, he inquired about what had happened to Brian. "Oh, it's a trouble." Mr. Dunkelman scratched the back of his head, pushing his knitted cap to the side. "But I've got an idea. Tomorrow I'll come and make an adaptation so that you can move in and out. But it would be better if you could get back on your feet finally, okay?" Brian smiled slightly and sighed. After work, Whitney opened her laptop and sat down on the soft couch. Without looking, she dismissed a message from her husband with another annoying question. Today, Ned, the director of the agency, finally noticed her and invited her to have coffee together at lunch. It was not in vain that Whitney wore short skirts and spent several hours each morning in front of the mirror. The determination with which Whitney pursued her goal of seducing the director was worthy of applause. The girl went with her boss to a coffee shop and made it clear in every possible way that she wouldn't mind continuing their communication in a more informal place. Ned caught the hint and at the end of the lunch invited the pretty employee to dinner at a restaurant at the end of the week. "His suit is clearly not from a local shop," Whitney muttered to herself, looking at photos of her boss on social media. "And he has nice watches and cufflinks." Her eyes burned with admiration, but also with self-satisfaction. Since she entrusted her husband to the care of her mother-in-law a month ago, Whitney realised that her life wasn't so bad after all. Work no longer stressed her out, and cooking and cleaning became rare occasions. The pictures of the boss told Whitney what she wanted to know. Ned, in his 35 years, was the owner of a nice house in the suburbs and 2 cars. Whitney reclined contentedly on the back of the sofa, scrolling through options for outfits for a future date in her head. Her sick husband and the fact of their legal marriage didn't slow her down one bit. The day came when Ned came to pick her up in his car, and in the morning Whitney woke up in her lover's house. Ned offered her coffee and asked if she wanted to go to the exhibition in a couple of days. Whitney coquettishly agreed. Everything went according to plan. At work, they decided not to advertise their relationship, although it was difficult to hide something in a female collective. Soon, the whole office surrendered to the fact that the boss had a young mistress. The first day of April was unusually warm. The sun seemed determined to make all the plants grow and blossom in a single day. Mr. Dunkelman was adding a sturdy and smooth ramp to the porch. "Nice weather," he said to Brian, who was sitting in his wheelchair, with the cat stomped, purring and kneading his sweater with his paws.
"Now, we'll fix it here. Knock and you'll ride there, like a racer,"
the elderly neighbour said contentedly, wielding a hammer.
"Yes, but I'm not going to violate traffic rules."
Brian smiled. Lately he had perked up slightly, perhaps due to the weather or maybe because he had finally accepted that Whitney had practically abandoned him. Additionally, Brian had found a way to alleviate his hated idleness. He decided to write a book about his extreme hobbies. He found a blank notebook in his desk and began to jot down ideas. Brian had never written any text before, except for school essays. However, he tackled the task quite vigorously. "It's done," Mr. Dunkelman explained, looking at the completed work.
"Well, Brian, try to go in for yourself."
Brian carefully pushed his wheelchair down the improvised ramp and then got upstairs.
"Well, that's good,"
the elderly neighbour said. "Grandpa," came a voice from behind the fence. "Are you there? Let's go to lunch. I've made soup and vegetables." Brian turned his head at the sound. A girl in a striped sweater waved from behind the gate. Her blonde curls poked out from under her cap, and her bright blue eyes were visible even from several metres away.
"It's my granddaughter, Tammy."
Mr. Dunkelman nodded imperceptibly to Brian.
"She's come for the weekend. She's studying in the city."
"Grandpa, come on. Everything will get cold," the girl demanded.
I'm coming. Why are you shouting?"
The elderly man waved good-natured at her.
"Say hello to your mum. I'll see you later. The beam under the roof here is bad. It would be good to fix it."
Mr. Dunkelman gathered his tools in a bag, waved to Brian, and went outside the gate to his granddaughter. April continued to be warm and windless. Brian had not written to Whitney for a long time, but he was actively working on the book. The second notebook was already completed. "Brian, can you go to the store yourself? We're out of salt," shouted his mother from the kitchen. "I can't leave or the pies will burn." The path to the grocery store was simple. A straight asphalt path, 250 metres long and a step-free entrance. "OK," Brian replied. He quickly put on his jacket, checked his pocket for change, and rolled towards the gate, happy to help. The tyres of the wheelchair rustled quietly on the already dry asphalt. Brian moved slowly, observing the village. In the grey and dreary winter it was depressing, but when the sun came out, the village came to life. Brian reached the store without any problems, bought salt and rolled back. Almost home, he heard a pitiful meow from the neighbour's roof. He looked up and saw his cat sitting there. Brian had noticed before that the cat used to climb up there using the scaffolding. The neighbours had been doing some repairs in the attic, and the scaffolding had been there all winter. But now that the repairs were over, the scaffolding had been removed, leaving the poor cat trapped on the roof. There was no nearby tree, lower roof, or suitable fence for the cat to climb down. "How do I get you down now?" That's a problem. Brian looked at the cat with a questioning gaze. He tried knocking and calling out to the neighbours, but they were not at home. The feeling of helplessness and inadequacy washed over him again. Poor cat! A familiar voice rang out, interrupting Brian's thoughts. Standing nearby was Mr. Dunkelman's granddaughter, squinting as she looked at the roof. Yes, I'm thinking about how to rescue him, Brian cautiously nodded. Yes, we can't leave the mustachioed one in a lurch, the girl said, and placed a bag of food on Brian's lap. Then she rolled up her sleeves and fearlessly climbed over the fence to the neighbour's yard. Tammy went around the house and found an old ladder in the shed. The ladder wasn't enough to step onto the roof, but it was enough to reach out and grab the cat by its paw. When the cat was rescued, Tammy handed him into Brian's waiting hands. She then carefully returned the ladder to its place and skillfully left the neighbour's yard, leaving no trace of their sudden intrusion. Thank you. I don't know how I would have managed it on my own, Brian said, handing the girl the bag of groceries. My name's Tammy, by the way. The girl introduced herself during the conversation. Probably you would have waited for another heartfelt passerby. My name's Brian, the young man replied, feeling embarrassed. Let me help you, Tammy offered, and opened the gate so Brian could pass through easily. She took an awkward step and tripped over the curb. Brian's reflexes kicked in and he quickly leaned forward to catch Tammy in his arms. Oh, I'm so clumsy, she exclaimed, hiding her embarrassment behind a laugh. It happens to everyone, it's okay, Brian reassured her, playing along. Tammy, why don't you come and visit us with Mr. Dunkelman? We can have tea together. Of course we'll come. Grandpa was just talking about something related to the roof. Tammy remembered and nodded in agreement. She waved goodbye, and for some reason, Brian felt an unexpected joy, like that of a child. He pushed the wheelchair onto the porch, opened the door to the house, and the hungry cat immediately rushed inside. It was only then that Brian realised what had happened just a minute ago. It was the first time since the accident that he felt his legs. Whitney stretched out on the bed, with rays of sunlight streaming through the window. The clock showed that it was around 10 in the morning. Ned was not around. He always left early, except on weekends. Work was the most important thing in the life of the director of a real estate agency, but Whitney was already considering resigning from her job. She was annoyed that Ned had not suggested it, especially since they were already in a relationship and he could support her financially. Whenever her colleagues called with questions about showing apartments to buyers, Whitney always made excuses. She was sick, busy, or had an urgent business trip. If he doesn't offer, then I should quit myself, Whitney decided while waiting for the coffee machine to brew. She liked Ned's house much better than her husband's apartment. It was quiet, spacious, and everything was conveniently within reach. There was a cleaning robot vacuum cleaner, a dishwasher, and everything else was automated to the maximum. It was always perfectly clean. Once a week, Ned hired a cleaning company to spotless the house. He couldn't stand dirt or clutter. Unlike Brian, he always took care of his appearance. All of this attracted Whitney. This was the life she wanted to live, the lifestyle she aspired to. She had already achieved the first part of her plan by becoming Ned's mistress. The next step was to gradually make herself indispensable in his personal space. Whitney was already eyeing Ned's second car, wondering if she needed a fur coat for the upcoming season, and considering when would be the best time to take a vacation. Her plans were ambitious. Whitney had a leisurely breakfast, took a shower, applied her makeup, called a cab, and left for work in a confident manner. "You're coming to work like it's a holiday," the manager greeted her, raising an eyebrow in slight surprise. "I'm not going to come to work anymore," Whitney informed her, placing her resignation letter in front of her. So you're leaving us to go freelance? Or have you found a better job?" The manager put the resignation letter in a folder. "You could say that." Whitney smiled mysteriously. She quickly gathered her belongings from the desk, bid her colleagues a curt farewell, and rushed out onto the street. It was wonderful how much determination Whitney had when the prospect of a relationship with a wealthy man presented itself. Whitney went home, dropped off her work things, and went shopping. The enterprising girl decided that a new set of beautiful lingerie would soften the blow of her resignation for Ned. In the evening, Whitney met her lover at his house and informed him of her decision. The man was surprised. "Quit your job? But why? You didn't seem overly busy, and you always received your salary on time." Whitney flirtatiously sat on his lap. "To spend more time with you. After all, a well-rested, beautiful, satisfied woman is better than a tired one." "Well, that's true. But what made you think that you were tired?" Ned was genuinely perplexed. "That's just how I felt." Whitney didn't like her lover's reaction. An awkward silence followed. But the man was the first to break it. "I also wanted to talk to you about the holiday in May. I thought maybe we could go to the mountains, rent a cosy, secluded house. What do you think of the idea?" At the mention of mountains, Whitney's face almost twisted. She was tired of the mountains in her life with Brian. "Ned, it might still be cold in the mountains, don't you know? Maybe we should spend a bit more and go to a warm place instead. Lying on the beach is better than getting dirty in the woods, don't you think?" The man agreed, and Whitney realised that she had won. Brian was eagerly anticipating the tea party with his neighbours, considering it to be an important event. He was also thrilled by the return of some sensitivity in his legs. This rekindled his hopes of flying again, or at least being able to walk on the grass with his own feet. Brian opened a folder containing the doctor's prescriptions, carefully studied the instructions for therapeutic physical training, and began to exercise slowly. Brian's mother couldn't help but shed a tear of joy as she watched her son practice. "Time will come and everything will work out as needed," she would sometimes tell herself in the evenings while tapping her knitting needles together. On a warm afternoon in mid-April, Mr. Dunkelman and Tammy appeared at their doorstep. The landlady invited them into the house, but the elderly man declined, saying that work should come first, and only then tea. He inspected the edge of the roof and got down to business. Mrs. Saylor initially fussed around, but eventually bid them farewell and went to cook dinner. Brian and Tammy settled on the porch platform, ready to assist Mr. Dunkelman with any tools he might need. "Your grandfather is wonderful, Tammy," Brian said. "I don't remember my grandfather. I was a toddler when he died." "I'm lucky," Tammy nodded and smiled, glancing at her grandfather, who was diligently hammering. "And yes, you're right. My grandpa is an example of diligence and optimism for the whole family." "It's quite noticeable," Brian agreed. "You're probably just like him." Tammy tilted her head mischievously and looked up at Brian. "In what way?" she asked, expectantly gazing at the guy. For some reason, Brian felt embarrassed, his heart racing. This simple and lively girl evoked feelings in him similar to the excitement of his first paraglider flight. "You're easygoing, witty and kind," Brian blurted out. She laughed and lightly rubbed Brian's shoulder. An hour later, Mrs. Saylor leaned out of the door and called out to everyone, "Enough with the roof, Mr. Dunkelman. And you two, come in too. The dumplings are ready and hot." "Mrs. Saylor, all you care about is filling your stomach. People might have work to do in the middle of the day," replied the elderly neighbour, busy with pliers. "Grandfather, don't grumble. Let's go, everything will get cold," Tammy gently scolded him. She grabbed the handles of the wheelchair and confidently pushed it towards the entrance. Protesting, Brian said, "What are you doing? Don't worry, I can do it." "Oh, let me take care of you," Tammy giggled, not stopping. When the two of them went to wash their hands at the back of the house, Mrs. Saylor slowed down the neighbour who was following and whispered, "There's something beautiful starting to bloom." "I'm not blind, I can see it," Mr. Dunkelman mumbled in reply, and the neighbours exchanged understanding smiles. When the group gathered around the table, steaming homemade dumplings with garden cherries, strong tea, and thick sour cream awaited them. Towards the end of the meal, Tammy secretly gave the cat a dumpling.
"Who's feeding the cat from the table?" Mrs. Saylor exclaimed, indignant. "Why don't you send them for a walk as punishment?" The grandfather winked at the woman. Tammy and Brian looked at each other simultaneously. "That's a great idea." The woman played along. "The weather is nice. No need to sit around. Go and pick a bunch of primroses. Behind the village near the pond, there's a whole bed of them." After finishing their meal, Tammy and Brian leisurely walked along the road. "Brian, so you can't walk at all?" Tammy suddenly asked, then immediately apologised. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked that. It's inappropriate." "Never mind," Brian replied calmly. "The doctors say there are chances, but for now, yes, I can't do it at all. I've started doing exercises to regain sensation, but sometimes apathy takes over, and I feel like giving up and accepting everything." "They say that human possibilities are limitless, and it's all about desire." Tammy looked at the sun, then at Brian. "I hope that in time you will definitely stand on your feet." They talked and talked about paragliders and tourists, about the shortcomings of student dormitories and teachers, about the countryside and the city, about the joys of life and trivial problems. For the first time in many months after the accident, Brian felt alive. Suddenly, the wheelchair hit a rock and Brian yelped. Tammy stopped. "Does it hurt?" "No." He looked up at her with a look of perplexed, breathless joy. "But I think I can feel my leg a little." Tammy widened her eyes and squatted down next to him. She lightly squeezed his leg just above the knee. Brian felt a barely noticeable, unpleasant, dull pain, as if through a pillow. Barely, but he felt it. "I can feel it," he whispered. "I can feel it for sure." Tammy jumped up and laughed, then rushed to hug Brian. A tear ran down his cheek, either from joy, happiness, or maybe both. Whitney was dozing in a chair with headphones on. Ned was sitting next to her, looking at something on his laptop. Clouds flashed in the porthole. The plane was taking them home from their vacation. Whitney was satisfied. Abroad, she had convinced her lover to buy her some expensive gifts. Meanwhile, Ned never initiated a conversation about living together, but Whitney sincerely believed that this would happen. When the couple rested after the morning flight and drank coffee on the balcony, Whitney once again glanced at Ned's second car. "I was thinking, maybe I could use your second car." "Why do you need it?" Ned looked at her questioningly, taking his eyes off the phone screen and his work correspondence. "Oh, to the store, to run errands, to fitness." Whitney began curling her fingers. "You can't do much in heels." "Just wear sneakers or boots, they're more comfortable," Ned shrugged. "And it's easier than buying a car." "Why buy a car when you already have one?" Whitney nodded at the blue fancy car. Ned followed her gaze and, after a pause, said, "The car isn't running. I'm waiting for a new engine for it. Then I planned to repair it, sell it. Besides, you don't have any driving experience." "I can gain experience," Whitney insisted, "and we can always sell it." Whitney knew how to beg convincingly. Since high school, she had realised that it was easier to ask until she got what she wanted than to make an effort and exert herself. And any awkwardness could always be smoothed over later with feminine methods. "So?" Ned squeezed Whitney's fingers irritably. "The car isn't running, so buy yourself a good pair of sneakers." Ned got up, took the mug with the remaining coffee from the table, and retired to his study, signalling that the subject was closed. Whitney grinned resentfully. She felt insulted by the recommendation, considering that beautiful shoes and stiletto boots had initially helped her win her lover. She remembered the kind and patient Brian, who couldn't give her a car, but never refused her other modest whims. A few days passed. She cooked a delicious dinner, brought good wine, and planned to bring up the topic of the car again. The evening passed in a cosy atmosphere until Ned suggested watching a new movie. The screen showed the serene life of a family with 2 children. The father was playing frisbee with his son,
and the mother was teaching her daughter to play the piano. A golden retriever was snoozing on the mat.
"I've always wanted a big family too," Ned suddenly said. "To have both a son and a daughter. I started all this business so that my children would have wealth and not lack anything."
Whitney, who was lying on his lap, listened carefully. So, this was the ideal image of a wife for Ned. An educated working mother. Well, no, she didn't want to become that. Why waste her youth and beauty on children when there are so many pleasures? Suddenly, she had an outstanding idea. A couple of days later, they had just sat down for breakfast when Whitney abruptly stood up from the table and desperately ran to the restroom.
"Are you okay?"
Ned anxiously knocked on the bathroom door. "Just feeling dizzy and nauseous all of a sudden," Whitney replied. Ned looked at her with a mix of joy and anticipation. "Maybe you're pregnant?" "It's obvious." Ned picked her up, sat her down on the living room couch and began to fan her. "And if I am, would you be happy?" Whitney put on the most naively righteous expression she could muster.
"Are you kidding? Of course."
Ned crouched down on one knee in front of her. "I've wanted kids for so long." "Okay, I'll go to the doctor tomorrow and find out everything." She sighed and hugged the jubilant Ned. Whitney had already thought of how to simulate pregnancy until the belly appeared. Nausea, mood swings, dizziness and bouts of appetite were no problem. Soon, a familiar doctor wrote her the medical document that she was pregnant. Ned was jubilant, bustling with activity, and had already chosen a name for their future child. He immediately moved Whitney to his place. In the evenings, he perused strollers and cribs, endlessly discussing everything related to children. Whitney suppressed her true feelings and tried to find a moment to file for divorce with Brian, so she could freely get married to Ned. Time was running out and every day mattered. Tammy only came to the village on weekends because the rest of the time she was attending classes. Brian missed the girl, but he focused on writing a book and doing leg exercises. Tammy supported his enthusiasm in both endeavours. During the month of exercises, Brian managed to move his toes. In another 2 weeks, he was able to tilt his foot slightly and tense his lower leg. With each new achievement, his motivation and will to live seemed to return. One day, Brian sat in a wheelchair near the porch and basked in the sun with closed eyelids. Suddenly, someone's hands gently covered his eyelids. "Tammy, did you think I wouldn't recognize you?" Brian said, laughing. "I've been sneaking silently," Tammy said and began to tickle Brian. He immediately laughed, shaking off the remnants of his midday slumber. Mrs. Saylor laughed, watching them fooling around. When the sun subsided, they all went into the house to drink tea. At the table, Brian discreetly placed his hand on Tammy's hand when his mother was busy putting jam. Tammy looked at him embarrassed, but didn't remove his palm. Brian felt as if he had returned to the time of with his first dates. Mrs. Saylor saw what was happening at the table, but didn't show it. Instead, she remembered some urgent business outside and left the kitchen. "Tammy, I need to talk to you," Brian began when he realized they were alone. The girl nodded and turned to him, completely on the stool. "About what?" "About what's going on between us." Brian sighed and took her hand again. "I really like you. You've become important to me, and you help me not to give up. I know you don't need a disabled person, and I'm married. Yes, my wife dumped me here like a worthless thing, but officially I'm still married." Instead of answering, Tammy hugged him tightly around the neck. "I need you no matter what, and I'm sure you'll get out of that damn wheelchair, and soon. And I care first and foremost about how you feel, not what's written in the documents." The man smiled at her and hugged the girl. "Let's get you back on your feet already." Tammy kissed him on the cheek, and then everything will work itself out. One day, they were in the living room. "Are you sure?" Tammy looked at Brian with great care. "Maybe we should wait." "Yes, I'm sure." Brian leaned on the arm of the chair with all his strength. "It's about time we tried it." Tammy stood and held out her arms to Brian. He cautiously started to rise, first on his elbows. His legs obeyed, but they felt weak, only a quarter of the strength a healthy person would have. His knees felt like the rusted hinges of a long unopened door. "Is it difficult?" Tammy watched him eagerly. "No harder than learning to walk as a child," Brian muttered. He placed one foot on the floor, feeling the soft carpet beneath it. Then he cautiously placed the other foot down, releasing his grip on the armrests. Doubts flooded his mind. Brian closed his eyes and reminisced about his first paragliding flight, soaring through the clouds, and the exhilarating embrace of the tree-covered slopes. Overwhelmed by long-forgotten sensations, Brian felt the support of Tammy and attempted to take a step. His leg felt foreign, as if cramped, but he persisted and slowly moved it forward. With sheer determination, one step led to another. With Tammy's encouragement, he managed to take a couple of feeble steps before wearily returning to his chair. "You're amazing!" Tammy hugged him. "Let's go to the doctor and document your progress. Maybe they can give us some recommendations to accelerate the process." What was said was done, and a few days later they were sitting in the doctor's office. "Well, you never cease to amaze," exclaimed the doctor after the examination. "At this rate, you could be running in 6 months. I've never seen patients recover so quickly from such injuries. It's a miracle, although we don't usually use that word in scientific circles. Keep up with the exercises, regain the former mobility of all parts of your leg. I recommend trying to walk with support." Inspired, Brian drove back home, his confidence growing. In this hopeful state of mind, he received an unexpected phone call. "Hello, Brian?" Whitney's voice came through the receiver. "I won't keep you long. Can we talk?" "Hi, what's going on?" A lump formed in his chest, along with memories that had almost faded away. "I've filed for divorce," Whitney informed him briefly. "I don't think I need to explain why. You're a grown, intelligent man, you'll understand." "Yes, I will," Brian confirmed her words. "Good. I hope it can be finalised quickly. I'll vacate your apartment in a couple of weeks. Goodbye." Whitney hung up. Tammy overheard the conversation. She turned to Brian and whispered, "It's for the best. Don't be upset. You said yourself that your marriage was just a formality." "You're right," Brian nodded. "But I did love her once." Whitney tapped her fingers contentedly on the armrest of her chair. Everything was going according to plan. Brian agreed to the divorce, though he didn't have much choice. Ned adored her. The pregnancy had been confirmed with a certificate. She had her own bank card with enough money to fulfill any desire at any time. Perfect. What more could she want? Whitney felt like a queen, with everyone she had used in her pursuit of the perfect life dancing to her tune. In the evening when Ned returned home, he first embraced Whitney and stroked her belly. She fed him a delicious dinner, poured wine and gave him a massage. When Ned warmed up, Whitney went on the attack. "Ned, I really want our child to be born in a legal marriage. I grew up in a complete family and find fatherlessness unacceptable." "I feel the same way," the man agreed. "I wanted to discuss this matter as well." Then he pulled out of the briefcase a jewellery box and placed it in Whitney's hands. "I wanted to do this properly, but since we're talking about it, why not?" "I agree," Whitney exclaimed, throwing her arms around Ned while marvelling at the size of the stone in the ring. They decided to get married in 3 months. By the time of the wedding, Whitney planned to finalise her divorce from her ex-husband, and after the ceremony, she would fake a miscarriage. The trap would close securely and on time. Whitney realised it was time to push harder. She rested her head on her lover's chest and said, "Ned, when my belly gets big, it will be difficult for me to get to the doctor and take care of other business. Maybe you'll reconsider getting a car for me. I could take a few lessons with an instructor to refresh my knowledge. What do you think?" "Maybe what you're saying makes sense," Ned thought. He put his hands behind his head and furrowed his brow. Whitney held her breath and peered expectantly from under her lashes. "All right," he finally announced his decision. "But we'll do things differently. I'll sell my car and buy you something more feminine. Sound good?" "Absolutely. Thank you, darling." Whitney squealed with delight and started hugging Ned again. "Brian, you should go to the city and get that wretch's stuff out of the apartment," Mrs. Saylor said as she placed a plate of rich soup in front of her son. "You've been divorced for 2 weeks already, and you're still procrastinating." "Mum, I'm not confident enough in my skills," Brian replied. Over the past month, Brian had made noticeable progress in rehabilitating his legs. He could now stand and sit, with support, walk slowly around the house with crutches. "Then call Tammy. She goes to town every Monday anyway and she'll help you," advised Mrs. Saylor, sitting down opposite him at the table. "It's not convenient for me. She's already here with me all the time as a caregiver," mumbled Brian. Mrs. Saylor placed her hand on his palm. "Son, this girl loves you, unlike that city girl. Don't lose her. Girls like her are worth any money in the world. Everyone makes mistakes, but that doesn't mean you can't try again." Brian finished his soup, then took out his phone and dialed Tammy's number. "Hi, I was wondering, would you go into the city with me soon? Maybe to check out the apartment?" The guy spoke, twirling his spoon nervously. "Of course, let's go," the girl agreed. "Are you sure you can already manage without the stroller?" "I should," Brian assured her. "Good." Tammy's voice warmed. "Then I'll be ready on Saturday." "I'm looking forward to it. Bye." Brian pressed the cancel button too soon. He wanted to say more, but once again his childish embarrassment ruined everything. How surprised he would be to find Tammy feeling the same way, standing in the middle of the institute with a phone in her hand. "I skipped the lesson to go with you," Tammy blurted out when they were already sitting on the train. Brian looked at her in surprise. He had decided for the first time not to take a wheelchair and use only crutches. "Why?" Instead of answering, Tammy kissed him on the cheek. He smiled into the measured, sleepy emptiness of the carriage, closed his eyes, and hugged Tammy tighter. The apartment, which Brian hadn't been to in almost 7 months, echoed with the familiar turn of the key and the smell. Standing on the threshold, he inhaled it, hesitating to enter. The smell reminded him of tourism and flying. There, in the closet on the balcony, lay his paraglider in a case. Next to it in a backpack were his equipment, trekking boots, a camera for aerial photography and a helmet. Whitney's belongings were not in the apartment. Contrary to Mrs. Saylor's fears, she had taken every last cream jar, and, judging by the traces in the bathroom, it had been quite recent. She didn't even bother to clean up. Brian and Tammy ordered some food for delivery and started to clean up. The man tried to do everything himself, but he periodically had to stop and rest. Tammy quickly tidied up the bathroom, re-washed the dusty dishes, vacuumed the floor, and wiped down the mirrors. "You're doing an impressive job," she praised Brian as they sat down in the evening on the living room sofa with sandwiches and cups of tea. "The doctor was right. You're getting better right before our eyes." "I'm too well motivated," Brian joked, looking at Tammy. She giggled and dropped the sausage in her lap. "I am truly grateful for everything you do for me." Brian took a piece from his sandwich and transferred it to the girl's sandwich. "But I'm also very drawn to the sky. I want to fly again and do what I love." Tammy furrowed her brow. She knew what had happened to Brian's partner and their touring car. "Aren't you afraid of injuring your back again?" "Honestly, I'd go through it all again." Brian looked at her with a challenging look. "Why?" Tammy bowed her head, perplexed. "To get to know you again." Brian leaned over, quickly pulled the girl to him, and kissed her. Whitney was diligently munching on pasta at the cafe during lunch with her friend. They had just visited a dozen wedding salons, looking for a dress for her and her bridesmaids. They had already chosen a restaurant, hired a photographer and a presenter. The menu was determined, and invitations were sent out to guests. "Aren't you tired of pretending to have a baby bump?" the friend asked her while sipping cold juice from a tube. "Tired, but what can I do?" Whitney grinned. "You have a great catch," her friend said dreamily. "Ned is handsome, wealthy, and has everything, not like your former pilot." "Oh, don't remind me," Whitney nodded, pushing her plate away. The man, in his 30s, and he was still fooling around, hiking in the mountains. "But it's okay, we're divorced now. He's forgotten, like a bad dream." "What's your due date?" Her friend nodded at her belly, grinning. "And where do you get the papers for Ned to believe?" "5th month. I'm eating like crazy. I've already gained 3 kilograms. How will I lose it all later?" "Well, just for 1 more week of patience, and then we will have a grief." Whitney snorted. "Jackie, my aunt's friend, does it for me. Just today I need to visit her." "You're a brave and smart woman, Whitney," admired her friend. "I wouldn't dare do such a thing." "If you want to survive, you must know how to be a predator." Whitney shrugged her shoulders. The girls paid for lunch and said goodbye. Whitney sat behind the wheel of a brand new red sedan, while her friend waited for a cab. In 30 minutes she was sitting in a doctor's office. Their sweet conversation was interrupted by a phone call. "Darling, where are you?" greeted Ned on the other end of the line. "I'm at my doctor's office. As soon as I'm done, I'll head straight home," said Whitney affectionately. "Great, I'm thinking of making risotto. Ask if you can have some, because there's wine in the recipe," Ned asked anxiously. "Okay, I'll make sure to ask. Bye." Whitney tapped the screen without looking and slipped the smartphone into her purse. "He is worried about my pregnancy," she muttered and laughed. "Well, why do you mind?" Jackie asked. "You could really get pregnant, considering your age. And you already have the right man, as they say. You could hire a nanny and have a baby and a social status." Whitney wrinkled her nose as if she had bitten into an unripe orange. "Are you kidding me? I'm already thinking about how to shed the extra weight. What if my belly really gets big? Stretch marks, swelling, and a C-section? God forbid. Maybe someday, but not now." "It's up to you, but I would do it for such a good husband." Jackie grinned. "So what do you need?" "An ultrasound at 16 weeks. I'll find someone who recently had one at the same stage." She sat down at the machine, then back at the computer and began searching for matching data. After a couple of manipulations with dates and last names, the necessary documents were soon lying in front of Whitney. The girl gratefully slipped them into her bag and handed an envelope to Jackie. "Have you already decided what to wear for the wedding?" she asked. "Yes, I've looked at a couple of options," the doctor replied. "I'll use your gratitude on them." Laughter filled the office. Whitney entered the house upbeat. "Weird, I thought he wanted to make risotto," Whitney thought, kicking off her shoes in the hallway. The house smelled like regular, instead of Italian cuisine, and it was unusually quiet, with no sound of pots clattering or knives chopping in the kitchen. Whitney walked into the living room and saw Ned sitting in a chair. "Did you decide to order food from a restaurant?" Whitney tried to joke. Ned looked at her glumly. "Give me the car keys." "Why?" Whitney asked, confused. Ned took a deep breath, then exhaled. "Give me the car keys immediately, then go to the bedroom. Pack all your things, call a cab, and get the hell out of my life." Whitney cowardly shrank back, tears welling up in her eyes. She tried to speak. "Ned, what's wrong?" "And tell your doctor that I'll make sure she loses her medical license. Or better yet, I'll sue her," Ned said, looking her in the eye. Whitney collapsed onto the carpet, her ears ringing and reality crashing down on her unprotected skin, burning and piercing her like hot needles. Ned squatted down beside her, took her chin and turned her face towards him. "You wanted to use me for your own gain, right? And it didn't work out because of an incomplete phone call. Wow, how inconvenient that turned out to be. Such foolishness. Just imagine." Whitney burst into tears of shame, but Ned no longer cared. Whitney remembered that evening as if it were a fog. She hastily packed her belongings into suitcases and bags in just 15 minutes, without even attempting to apologise, knowing it would be pointless. The offended director of the real estate agency made sarcastic remarks about her, drinking wine and silently observing as she frantically gathered her things. Before leaving, he took back all the expensive gifts he had given her, watches, jewellery and branded items. Whitney walked out of the gate with the same set of possessions she had arrived with a few months ago. "So are you ready?" Tammy stood in front of Brian, gripping his hands tightly. "Ready, my captain," the man exclaimed, laughing, as he placed a hand on his helmeted head. The paraglider airstrip stretched out before them. Beyond it, the autumnal mountain scenery loomed in unbelievable beauty. The slopes were adorned in a spectrum of colours from ochre to scarlet, as if painted by the sun. The grey-brown stones subdued the riot of autumn hues. It was the end of September. "When you land, don't put your feet down abruptly. Keep them up, we'll catch you," Sean advised Brian, adjusting his straps. "What are you fussing about?" Tom, the instructor, who had once taught Brian, peeked out from behind the passenger cradle. "He won't be flying until next season at the earliest. For now, I'm in charge." Okay, let's not argue." Sean raised his palms and stepped away from the runway with Tammy. "Let's go." Brian grabbed the safety harness and eagerly moved forward. Tammy gasped as the paraglider caught the wind and started to ascend, swaying gently. Sean shielded his eyes from the sun with his palm and muttered approvingly. "Oh, good. Keep it up. Good." "I'm still worried about him." Tammy nervously rubbed her fingers together. "Let it go." Sean patted her on the shoulder. "Tom is the best of the best. He will safely bring your beloved back to the ground." Tammy glanced at the brightly coloured dome of the paraglider, which had already risen even higher. "Let's go to the lower area. That's where they'll land." Sean motioned for the girl to follow the path. "And when will you fly yourself?" "I'll wait. Brian needs to fully recover," she replied. "I trust only him. Besides, it's so wonderful, amazing and beautiful here." She spread her arms wide and took in a deep breath, the air still warm and clean, but with a hint of autumn's chill. Sean laughed. "You haven't gone rafting with us yet, or ridden quad bikes in the mud. That's where you can experience all the charms of wild tourism." After a lively conversation, they reached the lowest site, where there were tents with a thermos of herbal tea and sandwiches. During the past summer, Brian and Tammy's lives changed a lot. They sold the apartment in the city and bought a smaller one further away from the centre. With the remaining money, they opened the agency of the author's travels. Tammy took charge of the company's information part, handling advertising, phone calls and documentation. Brian couldn't work as an instructor yet, as he had not fully recovered from his injury, but he gladly told tourists about the best places to visit and gave copies of his book with autographs to the most curious. The most significant change was in Tammy and Brian's relationship. They were now officially together. There was no extravagant wedding, expensive gifts or typical white dress. The couple simply signed the papers, spent time with loved ones, and headed to the mountains the same evening. By the time of the wedding, Brian no longer needed crutches or a wheelchair. He only walked with a cane. "It's so good to be here again, and everything is just like before." Sean stretched noisily with a satisfied face. "Almost the same," Tammy corrected him. "I apologise generously." Sean made an apologetic gesture with his hand. Suddenly Brian's phone, which was in Sean's pocket, got an incoming call. Sean deftly took out the device and put it to his ear. "Hi. No, it's not Brian. He's flying." Sean winked at Tammy, who listened with interest to this half-hearted dialogue. "How does he fly?" "Just like before. He's already recovered." "What?" "I think that's an irrelevant question. He's already married and loves her very much. Bye." Sean put the phone away. "Who was that?" Tammy asked curiously. "Oh, it's just someone like a fallen star." Sean waved his hands indefinitely in a direction. Suddenly he jumped up from his seat and shouted, "They're coming! Catch him!" Tammy jumped up and rushed after Sean. With Tom's help, they safely brought Brian back to solid ground. He was unhooked from the harness and he collapsed on the grass, spreading his arms and looking up at the pale blue sky with scattered clouds. "Alive?" Tammy asked, laughing. Alive as I've never been," Brian blurted out, absolutely happy.